Meeting open. Have we got Senator Antic on the phone yet? No. Senator Antic will actually participate by teleconference, so he'll join us when he can. And Mr Lim is now an apology for today. I declare open this hearing of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Law Enforcement into the law enforcement capabilities in relation to child exploitation. I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I extend that to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. These are public proceedings, being video streamed live via the parliamentary website, and a Hansard transcript is being made. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to the committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It is also a contempt to give false and misleading evidence. Witnesses also have a right to request to be heard in camera. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the grounds on which they make their objection, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. At today's hearing, as I said, Senator Antic will be by teleconference, and I remind committee members who are participating remotely and who are not speaking to mute their microphones, and for those in the room to switch off their phone or put on silence, please. If there are no objections from the committee members, I propose that the committee agree Friday the 2nd of December as the date for responses to any questions taken on notice. And I also remind committee members that the committee will hold a private meeting immediately after this hearing at 12:30. I now welcome Mr Hulley, representing Project Karma, and Dr Mark Zingzak, representing the United Church in Australia Synod of Victoria and Tasmania. And I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to the Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, would you please each state your name and capacity in which you appear today? And I invite both of you to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Glenn Hulley. I am the founder and CEO of Australian registered charity Project Karma. I don't have a prepared speech this morning. I don't believe I need to take up the time of the committee on that. This is our second submission. The second submission really was more highlighting upon the Trusted Partner Program that we're involved with Meta, but the majority of the points we wish to make are in our original submission from August last year.
Thank you very much. Doctor?
Dr Mark Zingzak, Senior Social Justice Advocate with the Uniting Church in Australia Synod of Victoria and Tasmania. I would like to make a brief opening statement. Firstly, the reason for a church appearing before here is, in our view, we provide a bit of a community check around approaching this. So we did do with our own members, we had a consultation around addressing online harms, particularly around focusing on child exploitation. So that happened in 2020. We went out to our members. We did a year-long consultation process because we wanted to weigh up how did they see the need for law enforcement measures versus the idea of online privacy. Out of that, we went to our synod meeting, which involves 300 people from across Victoria and Tasmania, both ordained ministers and just ordinary members of the community who are members of the church. And they unanimously adopted a position where they identified that dealing with online harms, particularly child sexual abuse, needed to outweigh privacy as the focus. So the impacts on privacy needed to be minimised, but clearly there needed to be a really high priority on addressing that as a general community thing. And I think that stands in stark contrast to some of the advocacy groups that will oppose pretty much any law enforcement measure or any measure that would try and address online child sexual abuse where it might have an impact on privacy. And I think that those views don't stand well with the broader Australian community, would be an opening position. In terms of our submission, I'll probably highlight the three key recommendations we had made were, particularly if the committee had a mind to recommend effective measures, no totally anonymous identities online. A provider should always know who you are. Doesn't matter whether your public-facing identity is anonymous, but someone needs to know who you are so that if you are engaged in serious harm, particularly child sexual abuse, law enforcement can identify you because the provider can tell them who you are. Secondly, better complaint mechanisms so that people who identify child sexual abuse material can easily report it to the provider. There is quite a bit of evidence that the current mechanisms put barriers in the way of people being able to make those reports and deter particularly survivors of child sexual abuse from being able to report material about themselves. The third one, which came out of the Australian Institute of Criminology, had a conference just 2 weeks ago. It would have been great if that had occurred prior to being able to put in the submission. Their latest research, one of the key findings was that 42% of people who saw CSAM for the first time did so while searching for adult pornography. So they weren't intending to find child sexual abuse material, but ended up there. Now, for us, that reinforces the notion that there should be an expansion in the blocking, the effectively access disruption mechanism that ISPs are required to do. We have suggested, at the very least, it could be expanded out from the Interpol Worst Of list to the Internet Watch Foundation list. And further, we'd take a view that it might be great for the ISPs to be required to capture data about the IP addresses that are trying to access and get the block message, not for police to investigate every one of those, but what it might throw up as a large data set is you could do data analytics on it, and that might identify patterns or people who are making multiple attempts to access material, which indicates they are worthy of law enforcement attention. I would also point the committee to the recent report which came out in May by Brian Neal Levine in the US, he was commissioned by the US Department of Justice to look at how to increase the efficacy of law enforcement responses to online child sexual abuse. It's well worth a read. We would recommend also an increase in the funding for the Australian Institute of Criminology with the work they are doing. It is greatly informing responses to child sexual abuse material, and they did receive funding under the previous government. There was nothing in the latest budget that would extend that, so it'd be worthy of the committee recommending into the future that to make sure they have the funding to keep going forward. My final point would be I think this as a problem needs a public health response, so as much as possible we need to be looking at measures that passively, without requiring active intervention, drive down the prevalence and incidents of online child sexual abuse and make the pool of abuse that is taking place that law enforcement need to deal with as small as possible. Thank you.
Thank you both for your opening statements. I think I'll, before I go to you, Mr. O'Brien, I was just wondering, in terms of Project Karma, how that work on the ground actually, how you operate with law enforcement authorities. Would you be able to give us some evidence in relation to that?
Yeah, sure. We conduct investigations in many different countries around the world, particularly in Southeast Asia, but also here in Australia. And we provide that information to the relevant law enforcement body of that region. And we often work closely with them in following through to a result. In the case of Australia, we've provided information to Australian Federal Police and State Police over many years, and quite often that has led to investigations by law enforcement that have led to arrests and prosecutions, and also of rescuing of victims. Those relationships are built over a long period of time, trusted relationships between law enforcement agencies in different countries. I've highlighted in the past the inability of Australian Federal Police to be able to enter into any sort of memorandum of understanding with non-government organisations. That's been a problem for us in the past, and it's been highlighted in our submission, particularly in relation to sharing of information. Again, that touches on what Mark was talking about before in relation to privacy and things like that, and we do see the need to protect people's information, but as I've said in many interviews and also in my past testimony that I gave to the 46th Parliament Committee, that there's a lot of information and data pools that non-government organisations hold, like Project Karma. We're not the only organisation in the world that does this type of work. Investigations, prosecution and rescue is really just the second pillar of our Sentinel model, which we've described in a little bit of detail in those submissions, and happy to expand on those if you'd like to know more. But we're talking about that second pillar at the moment, and a number of organisations around the world are credible and have copious amounts of data in relation to offenders, suspicions, and none of that information is broadly shared with law enforcement. Unless the NGO takes it to the law enforcement agency, there's no way for law enforcement agencies to know. And that's vice versa as well. And we've found many times where we've been engaged in an investigation that quite possibly that was being investigated by another organisation or by law enforcement as well. And everybody's operating on the same case, but nobody knows about it. And that's a large problem that we see.
Can I ask then, is it primarily privacy laws that is preventing that, or do you think there could be, or there are other issues in relation to whether or not they think that the NGOs have the capacity in terms of security to protect that information?
Correct. I think that's part of it. I don't think it's all to do with privacy. I also think it's got to do with internal policy. Having been in law enforcement 13 years in my career prior to doing what I do now, I'm pretty familiar with how some of these things operate and how law enforcement agencies interact with external agencies. So I think there's some issues there in internal policy, also privacy and what you're highlighting.
So in terms of the ACCCE and how they facilitate cooperation and collaboration around these things, can you add anything further to your submission?
They've been very selective in the organisations they've chosen to partner with, which I understand. However, I think it's only 3. And most of them are focused towards education and rehabilitation. When it comes to investigation, I don't believe law enforcement here in Australia are really that interested in working with organisations that can provide detailed information in relation to this. I believe they see themselves as the be-all and end-all, which I totally understand, having been in law enforcement myself. But the reality is that a number of these organisations do hold very important information that I think would be of high benefit to organisations like Australian Federal Police.
So in terms of members of your organisation, what's their typical background?
Well, quite often we don't want any background in law enforcement or investigation. I've found over my years of training investigators that quite often a clean slate is best to work with. Bad habits can be picked up early in investigative careers, and it's very hard to undo that. The way we do investigations is very different. We're not law enforcement, so therefore we don't have access to the type of databases and information that law enforcement have on a daily basis and what I was used to working in law enforcement. So the way we have to do our investigations are a little different. And that takes a lot of adjustment for someone who has ex-law enforcement background to come in and try to learn how to do investigations differently. So quite often we prefer no background, and we have a series of tests, so to speak, to try to pick the aptitude of a person and their ability to think broadly and conduct investigations before we would then invest our time and effort into training them for that purpose.
And if I could just, before I hand it over to Mr O'Brien, ask both of you, in a lot of the submissions there's been evidence given that there has been over the last 2 to 3 years an increase in this type of crime. From your experience, is this a matter of, well, people were locked down at home so therefore they had regular access to the internet, or are there other factors? So if you wouldn't mind.
There's no doubt that the pandemic and lockdown has increased online crimes. We ran a campaign beginning in, I think it was around April 2020, an awareness campaign online and in Australian media. Appeared on a number of well-known Australian TV shows, Studio 10 and other morning news programs, explaining to the Australian community about the dangers of the increase of these types of crimes during this period, where children are at home more and online more, and offenders are at home online more. And unfortunately that was accurate, and we have seen major spikes in these crimes. I think the Australian Federal Police reported 122% increase in Australia, but we've had partners in the Philippines have reported over 300% increase in these crimes during the pandemic. As a trusted safety partner with Meta, we've received, I think over 300 reports that we've put in over that period of time. And many of those have led to investigations by law enforcement and resulted in arrests and prosecutions. So yes, there's been a large increase. I don't think it's solely because of the pandemic. These crimes were already increasing before that. It didn't help the situation, but now that this pandemic is slowly coming to an end, I don't see that this is going to then lower these crimes. I think there needs to be a proactive approach to targeting the reduction of these crimes.
Thank you. Doctor, would you like to add something?
Yes, look, I think the other things I'd want to add into this is we've also seen an expansion into abuse on other platforms. So onto, for example, dating platforms, also the increase in apps where this kind of activity might take place. And that was one point I'd probably make, is that while apps are currently rated for their actual content inside the app, they're not rated against their safety features. So if you're a parent or a child, you've got no idea when entering an app how safe that is, what the chance is that predators can easily use that to target children inside that app. So are there things of that app that actually facilitate abuse? It'd be great to see a standard that actually requires the rating of apps. The other part of that, though, is look, I think there definitely has been an increase, but also some of the measured increase is because of better detection. So, for example, Glenn talked about the Philippines. Part of the reason that increase, definitely there is underlying increase, but also, for example, the Financial Intelligence Unit in the Philippines has increased its efforts in actually detecting this crime and actually addressing it. So part of the increase is probably increased detection. I would also point out the data that often gets quoted around the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children in the US, where there's reporting. As Meta has rightly pointed out, when you, some of that, you talk 69 million reports, some of that is repeat reports of the same content hosted. It's still a problem, because what it's saying is for the victims and the survivors of that, whose material is out there all the time, that's ongoing abuse for them. But in terms of the number of victims, it's a much smaller pool of the number of victims that relate to that large pool of material. On the flip side of that as well, of course, is that's only detected material, and there's still a pool of undetected material as well. So often measuring these things, there is quite a bit of uncertainty, but I would certainly agree there's been an increase in the prevalence of this abuse and human rights abuse online. Look, while I'm speaking, the only other thing I would want to, going back to Glenn's first point, I would point the committee, there's a very good book by Jason Sharman, Professor Jason Sharman, called Vigilantes Across Borders. Despite its name, it actually talks very positively about the role of third-party civil society organisations, and it's got a chapter that focuses on the increased role of third-party agencies in assisting law enforcement around addressing human rights abuses and the positive role that can play, particularly for a crime type of this nature, or a human rights abuse of this nature, where the pool is so large that the law enforcement resources will never match the size of the pool. So law enforcement needing to look at how do we increase our capabilities and bring on more allies that would assist us without compromising our investigations, I think is well worthwhile.
Thank you very much. Mr O'Brien.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Dr Zernsak and Mr Hulley for coming before us today. It's very much appreciated. If I can just start with Mr Hulley, can you give me a bit of a practical rundown on what an investigation by CARMA looks like?
Sure. Are we talking an online crime investigation? Okay, so we will receive information of a particular content on a platform. It may be a Meta-owned platform. We're part of the Meta Trusted Partner Program, where we have a direct line reporting portal directly to Facebook, or as they're called, Meta, safety officers there. They have a safety and trust division and a law enforcement response team, and they're regional based. So Australia is covered under their Singapore head office, and there's a team there that we essentially can provide reports to for any content on Meta servers that we come across. The first port of call is reporting it with them, and they have a process to then notify law enforcement, providing that material isn't just a breach of their community standards, but is actually illegal and is breaking the law. As you're probably aware, not just Meta, but other companies that have these types of platforms online are held to account in the sense that this content, any sort of child sexual exploitation material on their servers, is illegal. And if they're caught with that material on their servers and not have done anything about it, they actually stand to lose their operating licence. It's very serious. And that's really a result of a lot of the efforts in the United States putting pressure on companies like Meta. You would have seen the head of Meta was brought before a Senate Congress hearing, and answered a lot of these sort of questions about what the company was doing in relation to this. And there was some really big problems. From 2012, when we first started looking at this, through till 2016, 2017, they really weren't doing anything about this type of thing. So those things have been put in place now. So to get back to your question, is that evidence would then be flagged and it's removed off Facebook servers. Now, we don't want that information to then disappear. It's obviously evidence, but Facebook or Meta cannot hold on to it. So there's a mechanism in place. Mark might be familiar with this as well, but the content usually goes through Internet Watch Foundation and part of the National Exploited, what is it, sorry, it's NECMEC, I always call it NECMEC, and it's held there, and law enforcement from anywhere in the world can actually apply to then get access to that information in order to conduct an investigation and pursue criminal charges. So that's the process, and so as an example, we would receive some of that information. We would see a post, or somebody might contact us and say that they're part of a Facebook group, for instance, or a WhatsApp group, and that this content is being shared. They might send us a screenshot, because in some of these, like I just mentioned, with WhatsApp, it's an encrypted platform, so therefore, unless you're a member of that group, being able to get access to that content is quite difficult. So screenshots and other mechanisms are used to provide the evidence to us, which we then go through that process that I just spoke about before.
So what other than online
in contact
people
crimes.
passing
in contact
on
crimes.
information and you then passing it on to the relevant provider, what are the other types of offences or types of potential offences that you investigate? Yeah,
so the online stuff that I just spoke about is not just sharing of actual material, but also grooming, where we might have an example of a child that's being groomed by an adult with the purpose to sexually exploit that child. It may have already been in an advanced stage where the child has already been coerced into providing some form of photographic material. That makes it very uncomfortable for that child, because then the threats begin of, we're going to send this to your parents, or we're going to send this to your school friends unless you provide more of this type of thing. This is becoming a very common type of crime. So that's another example of an online type of crimes that we deal with. But we also deal with in-contact crimes, in-person contact crimes, where someone has travelled from Australia to one of these locations for the purpose of sexually exploiting children. So we'll get information about that, and not just Australians, obviously anybody that's committing these crimes. We have a vast intelligence network that I've developed over a number of years, particularly through Southeast Asia, and so we have reports every day. And those reports are vetted, and if there's substance to them, we commence an initial investigation, and we put a body of evidence together, and then we speak with the relative law enforcement agency for where that crime's being committed and coordinate with them in order to enact a law enforcement investigation.
So at some point in time, if you get the information, you said your first port of call is to pass that information or report that information via the portal. At what point do you engage with the local authorities if you think that it's domestic, if it's here in Australia?
In some cases we don't, because Meta's processes do that themselves, their law enforcement response team, and I'm sure the Australian Federal Police can expand on this further for you about their relationship with Meta. But essentially the law enforcement response teams coordinate with the Australian Federal Police if it's an offence involving an Australian or a child that's in Australia, and they have their processes in place as to then how the Australian Federal Police deal with it. So in those cases, we don't need to deal directly with the Australian Federal Police. In other cases, we do, and we not just the Australian Federal Police, but state police as well. We've dealt with every single state police force in Australia at some point over the last 6 years. And we'll provide a detailed briefing note on what information we've received and what we've done to validate that information, and provide that to the law enforcement agency, give them the best chance of being able to identify the offender and pursue a thorough investigation.
What sort of training do you give the people who are working for you?
Yeah, we provide investigation training to our investigators, but we also provide training to law enforcement. We've run a number of courses in Southeast Asia. The most recent, prior to the pandemic, was in Bali. We have a network of people like myself that have got a law enforcement background, and some of them are well renowned in law enforcement for training, and they're willing to give of their time. We're very lucky and very fortunate. I've had some world-class law enforcement trainers come to these countries and provide training to international police and also to our own investigators, which is fantastic because, as the example in Bali, I have my team of investigators from Indonesia present during that training right alongside Indonesian law enforcement, and it helps to bridge that gap between I know it's probably hard to understand, but being in law enforcement myself, I know what they're like. It's very much we're the experts, we're the ones that have the power to do something about it, you're just an NGO. And it's a very unlevel playing field. But when you put them all in the same room and they're all receiving the same training, much more peer recognition. And that then extends outside of that room into real life when we're doing these investigations. The attitude's a lot more open and honest and transparent, a lot more trust. So the training is provided by experts.
And obviously you'd have vetting processes for the people who
Yes, of course.
You're employing or are working under you. Can you go into that and how you make sure that the people that are actually coming to you aren't offenders that might be getting information or seeking?
Yes. We've been contacted by people that have been quite suspicious over time, and our processes have identified that. I think that's a natural expectation that people that do commit these crimes, particularly those from organised crime and those that are profiteering from this. So we're not just talking about opportunistic offenders, we're talking about people that are dedicated to making money from this. Yes, we expect that they're going to be trying to find out how we operate and what we do. And we have had examples of that in the past. But when it comes to employing someone, again, it depends what country that we're doing this in. So we have a head office in Bali, which is our Southeast Asia regional head office, and we have Project Karma is registered in Indonesia as a separate entity. And that allows us to be able to enter into memorandums of understanding with government child protection agencies and Indonesian law enforcement. Again, we can't do that in Australia. The mechanisms don't exist. But that allows us to vet our candidates with criminal background checks through the police. And then there's, like I said before, there was an aptitude test that we put prospective candidates through. Providing they pass that, then we can enter into a training process. But it's usually at least a 1 year period before they begin conducting investigations. So there's a lot of time there in which we would be able to weed out any of that sort of problem.
One more question and then I'll have to go someone else.
Yeah. So are any of your volunteers or workers in Australia vetted criminally?
Yeah, volunteers, we ask that they provide a criminal history check, yes. And there is a contract process that we have for all our volunteers, yes.
That's all I've got, thanks.
Thank you. Ms Miller-Frost.
Thank you. Look, you've mentioned Meta quite a bit. Do you have similar relationships with Twitter, and are the current changes and the sacking of a lot of their community standards, I mean, how's that playing out?
Well, Twitter's an interesting one to mention at the moment. That's all up in the air, as you're probably aware, with Elon Musk buying it out and getting rid of 7,000 people or something like that. I've been informed that earlier this week we had, last week, that Meta has also cut a lot of jobs recently. So, and we're yet to see where from. We're hoping that's not from their safety and trust divisions. It would be, I guess, completely the opposite to what we've seen in recent years. I mean, Meta has invested a lot of money into building these safety mechanisms. So I'd be surprised if they've cut from that. Having said that, though, these are for-profit companies, and all they're interested in is making profit. So these types of measures prohibitive to them. There's no profit in it. If anything, it's costing them money. The only incentive for them to do it is the fact that, like I mentioned before, if this content is found on their servers and they haven't done the right thing about it, they stand to lose their operating licence, which is very serious. So I think that's, unfortunately, the only reason they've acted the way they have. But to answer your question, yes, we have relationships with multiple platforms. We've mentioned a number of those in the submissions. I've spent a lot of time speaking with Roblox, which you may be aware of, which is it's a child app that many children in Australia, around the world, play games. They're games that can be designed by the users and played by the users. What we've found over a series of months, going back to 2020, is that the way that these kids communicate while they're playing the game is by using another third-party application, which is called Discord. And Discord is a very popular chat and voice chat and message chat program, and it goes hand in hand. And that was a very big challenge for us, is that Roblox would say, well, we're doing what we can to protect kids on our platform. Meanwhile, you've got groomers on Discord that are meeting the kids in the game, talking to them in Discord, and their goal is to get them off those platforms and onto an encrypted platform where they can start a grooming process. And when you've got two separate companies, each of them going, well, we're doing our part, but not recognising that both of their products are actually creating a problem. That's been a challenge, as an example. But yes, to answer your question, we speak with a number of different platforms.
Thank you. Dr. Zernak, I think you mentioned something about a public health approach to addressing this issue. Can you explain to me what that might look like?
Sure. So that it means increasing the number of passive measures we have to drive down this crime type. So that could be everything from increasing educative efforts, of which the analysis by Mr. Levine that I mentioned earlier, he's positive towards that. I have some question marks because often the analysis of educative impact is measured by recall. So you provide the education and, 6 months later you go and say, do you remember what you were taught? That's fine, but what you want to know is what behaviour change does that make, or when you're in the moment and you're actually online, how has that education delivered on that? But that said, I think education is one measure, and then you've got all sorts of ways of the e-Safety Commissioner's program on safety by design, for example. So building inherent features in the platform that actually help drive this down. So, I mentioned earlier, for example, a measure that says you can't have a completely anonymous identity where even the provider doesn't know. That's a public health measure, because effectively you're removing any sense of impunity that person might otherwise have in that space. It would be things like, again, Mr. Levine talks about one thing that would be, there's already some development of and could be rolled out more, would be grooming detectors. So you can actually have automated programs that help detect grooming. So at the moment, a lot of the detection is done by people. You're not looking to replace that, but you might actually help by looking at more automated tools. Project Arachnid, that crawls the web, detecting existing material and identifying it, referring it on to then human classifiers to actually identify, is it child sexual abuse material? So it's those sort of broader approaches, because what you're trying to do is really create in the mind of someone who might be tempted to engage in this abuse, there's a higher risk factor, so there's less people willing to do it, and therefore the pool of dedicated offenders who law enforcement need to focus on gets shrunk more and more. And then also it means that law enforcement, with the smaller pool, when they do prosecutions, the impact of that as a deterrence is increased, because the probability as an offender now I've got to weigh up, there's a much higher chance of me getting caught. Whereas if there's 100 prosecutions for 10 million offenders, then, my chances of getting caught, I might weigh are small. Yeah. By comparison. Yeah. I don't know. Glenn might want to add to that in terms of the public health approach.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Mark's saying. And I will expand just briefly. Mark and I were talking about this morning. It's something that I've been talking about for 5 years to different politicians, the media, is that this should be treated as a public health response. Pedophilia has been defined in DSM-5 in psychology as being a mental disorder, right, under paraphilias. And what we know about mental disorders is that there is no cure for any mental disorder. There is only management and treatment. And I think that is the mental switch that our politicians, our law enforcement, our judiciaries need to understand. In order to create laws that are going to be effective, we need to understand what paedophilia is. We're still of the mindset of it's just another crime and we put them in jail and we expect there'll be some form of reform and then there's a deterrent for when they come back out. It doesn't work. And, you know, we can't lock people up forever. We can't lock people up for what they're thinking either. You know, and so there needs to be a whole different way of looking at this, is my opinion. And I think coming up from as an angle of mental health, or coming from a public health issue, I think it opens the door to so many more resources and strategies that can be put forward in a proactive way.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Antic, are you still online? Do you have any questions? If not, would you like to have some questions, Dan?
Thank you, Chair. Questions for you, Glenn, mainly, is how many cases are currently underway in Australia that you're aware of, that you've been working
That we
on?
have?
Yes.
About 17 cases I have on the go in Australia at the moment.
Yep. And what about into Asia as well?
I'd have to double check the figures, but we have ongoing cases all the time. But we would average somewhere around 100 cases in Indonesia per year.
Okay, yep. And with the Asian area, obviously it's a much bigger problem there than it is here. How are you working with law enforcement there to make sure that they're getting on top of this? Because obviously corruption's rife there as well, in law enforcement as well. How are you making sure that you're talking with the right people? What checks and balances do you do there?
Yeah, look, corruption is always a challenge. At the end of the day, had to recognise there are certain goalposts that can't be moved, that we're not going to be able to change, and we have to work within them. So we have strategies to try to counteract against that. Building relationships at higher levels in law enforcement is very important in those countries. But having said that, we've seen 3-4-star generals dragged down because they've been caught in relation to corruption, and we might have had 2 or 3 year relationship with that person. So these are challenges we face all the time. We see it in judiciary. I've had cases in the Philippines where a judge was bribed, and that offender walked, unfortunately. So, these are challenges that we face that we can't. I guess there's not a lot we can do about it other than present the best case possible, and where we do detect corruption, try to have mechanisms on how to report it.
Yep.
But having said that, we have cases in Australia too that have been either corrupted or just mismanaged.
Yeah.
And when we say that the crimes are more rife over there, well, it depends what sort of crime you're talking about. I would challenge that it would be the complete opposite when it comes to offenders online committing these crimes. I would say on ratio there'd be more Westerners, particularly Australians, online committing these crimes than there would be Filipino citizens online committing these crimes. We create a market. And that was true when I started this process in 2013, 2014, where the market was Australians going over to these countries. But what we've seen is with the better internet in these poorer countries, a lot of Australians don't need to go overseas to commit the crimes anymore. They can do it from home because these countries now have cheaper internet. They're able to get online. So that, again, we're creating a market. If there was nobody wanting to watch this sort of stuff, then a family in the Philippines isn't going to go and get their 4-year-old girl and sit her in front of a webcam because nobody wants to see it.
And you're right with Roadblocks as well. Roadblocks is an extremely alarming platform that they use. My daughters use it, and it genuinely concerns me.
My children use it, and I was the worst person on earth for a week there because last year I had some conversations with the head of their security and safety division, who's based in Ireland. And as a result of those conversations, it led to they stopped the feature of the chat if you're under 12 years old. Now, again, I know this is not a silver bullet by any means. I mean, kids can start an account and say whatever. That's part of this problem is they can make up whoever they want to be. But if it's been done legitimately and you're under 12, you can no longer use the chat program, the chat feature within the game, and that my kids were very upset about that.
Very good. Thank you.
Any further questions?
Sorry, just on that last point, the one point I'd want to make on that is currently the environment that's set up in the online world is totally skewed, well, not totally, but largely skewed towards the providers. And again, Mr Levine's, the report he wrote for the Department of Justice covers this in great detail about how the laws are skewed to protect the providers and not the users, particularly when they're children. And for example, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act sort of protects providers from being prosecuted, but there's no equivalent protection there. And what we really need is these providers to have, what we've seen really is they really only move once law enforcement or once governments introduce laws that force them to move down these paths increasingly and therefore increasingly shifting. In the same way that, we saw the Westpac got hammered for not detecting and reporting child sexual abuse under the anti-money laundering laws, we need a similar sort of approach to these online platforms to provide safety. And what they do is, they'll argue for privacy of users, but they're not protecting the privacy of those who are survivors. So when someone's sharing an image of someone who's been abused, that's a violation of the privacy of the survivor. Yep. Yet what we hear from the platforms is they need to protect the privacy of the offenders and the abusers, not of the survivors. So I think it really is up to governments to start changing the playing field and really forcing these providers to move into this safety by design space and be proactive in having to deal with these problems.
Yeah, okay.
I have a question in relation to evidence, obviously in submissions. I think it was from you, Mr Harley, that there is issues with the law enforcement with different jurisdictions in this country alone. Would you be able to elaborate on that for us?
Sorry, just to refresh my memory, in which submission was that?
It's just, I think, in a number of submissions.
Yep.
And I just wondered, really, from your experience, whether that is an issue, because we know generally that there's not the sort of collaboration necessarily with all levels of law enforcement
Yep.
with each other, and different jurisdictions, different laws, different penalties. Has that been an issue for you?
Yeah, sure, I understand what you mean now. Yes, I guess, each state has their own laws in relation to this. In fact, this actually relates very closely to the issue of a public accessible child sex offender register in Australia, where each state has their own legislation towards it. And I'll use this as an example at the moment. We have a federal government that had said, righto, we want to have this. We want to have a national database and we want to have that publicly accessible. And they put money aside for it. Budgeted for it, which you're probably aware of. Unfortunately, it wasn't thought through too well, because the minute they wanted to do this, they realised they have to work with their state partners. And of course, each state wants to do this their own way. And to this day, we still don't have a resolution on this. So until we can get the states and territory governments to work with the federal government, it'll never happen. And that we find quite discouraging. But that is an example of jurisdictional problem that needs to be addressed if we're serious about trying to stamp out these crimes and protect the public. I know there's twos and fours for having a public register. We support it, and that's an example. But this extends to international, the issues that you're talking about as well, where Australian law enforcement interacting with international law enforcement and the jurisdictions and how to process and share information. Credit where credit's due, the Australian Federal Police, the ACCC have done a lot in this space in the last 5 years. I can honestly say that 5 years before that, it was the Wild West, and that the Australian Federal Police was just the best they could do. There are now quite intricate relationships that have been developed. Things like the PICAC system that they've set up in the Philippines. They've got a similar one in Thailand under the TICAC system. These are systems that Australia's had a very strong hand in developing in partnership with our partners like the US Department of Justice and Homeland Security and other, the UK CHEOPS, that have all been involved in setting up these international partnerships. And from those, we're finding there's much better integration and sharing of information.
One final question, because I know we're going to run out of time, and I apologise. But in terms of, is there any country that is leading the way in terms of the systematic response from law enforcement with NGOs that we could look at as a role model, or is Australia one of the leading countries?
My opinion, Australia is one of the leading countries. I think the US is up there, and Canada. But honestly, I think Australia is definitely heard the call, and the government over the last 5 years has made serious inroads, and it needed to be done. And like I said before, credit where credit is due. We still have a long way to go, but I do believe Australia is one of the leading countries on this at the moment.
I would agree with that, and I think pointing to the US and Canada, I mean, while law enforcement is very clear in those spaces, the laws work against them. We were looking at even the issue of getting warrants to access data, like the US Department of Justice guidance for law enforcement to do that. It's like 250 pages thick because of the complexity of US law and the overlapping between federal and state law and the different circuit courts and so forth. So we have a much cleaner, much more, government here has done a much better job of providing law enforcement with an environment in which they can operate more effectively. Still much further to go, but I would agree that we're in one of the leading countries on this by a long way.
Thank you both very much, not only for your submissions and giving evidence today, but the work that you do to protect young people around the world. So thank you very much. And we call our next witnesses and welcome Senator Shoebridge. And can we confirm whether Senator Antic is still online?
He is on the line.
He is on the line, so... Well, perhaps if he lets us know.
Always let me know.
Yes.
Email him.
Excellent.
Yeah, we can have a talk about it. Yeah, we'll see if there's something we've got that would be appropriate. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The entire planet. I do now welcome representatives of the Office of E-Safety Commissioner and the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development, Communication and the Arts. The Senate has resolved that an officer of the Department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officers to a superior officers or to a minister. The resolution does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policy or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. I understand that the information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to the Senate committees has been provided to you. For Hansard records, would you please each state your full name and capacity in which you're appearing before us today? And after doing so, I'll invite anyone who wants to make an opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Toby Dagg, Acting E-Safety Commissioner.
Bridget Gannon, Assistant Secretary, Online Safety at the Department.
Daniel Gleeson, I'm a Director of Projects and Implementation in the Online Safety Branch.
Is Mr. Dagg, are you going to make an opening statement? No. No? Go straight to questions. It's even better. Mr. O'Brien.
I'm going to pass just for the moment, Chair.
Okay. Ms. Miller-Frost, would you like to kick off?
Sure, thank you, Chair. I'm not sure who this would go to. In terms of the sorts of reports that you're getting, who do you generally get them from? Is it generally from parents or the general community, or is it more from, I don't know, businesses and the platforms themselves?
Our reporting pathways are public reporting pathways. So the Act is designed in a way to take reports in slightly different ways depending on the particular scheme. So when it comes to reports about child sexual exploitation material, a report can be made by any Australian resident or body corporate. Now, we offer an anonymous reporting option in order to achieve the greatest volume of reports about actionable child abuse material. And in the last financial year, we dealt with about 15,500 reported URLs. And that's significantly higher, about 65% higher than pre-pandemic. So we've seen a major shift through the course of the pandemic. In terms of the reports that we receive from under 18s about image-based abuse, so that's the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, the reports that we receive are almost all made by children and young people, but they can authorise a person to make a complaint on their behalf. So it's reassuring actually to see that we're seeing more parents and carers involved in making reports on behalf of children and young people. But those reports are on the rise as well. So as an example, between December last year and June this year, we saw a 210% increase in reports from under 18s, mainly around sexual extortion.
Wow, okay, that's
What
phenomenal.
brought that about?
yeah.
Why the sudden increase in reporting? Have you ran a campaign? Is it, what's the keys to that?
Chair, I think awareness is certainly part of it. There's no question that we've significantly upped our public activities in terms of articulating the role of the Safety Commissioner, and the department's done some terrific work as well in driving an advertising campaign around the Online Safety Act. So that's certainly part of the explanation. We've found that some of the media appearances conducted by the Substantive Commissioner, Julian Grant, have led to an increase as well. So there was a 60 Minutes piece done earlier this year that led to a significant surge. So yes, awareness is part of it. But we saw a very large shift during the course of the pandemic, and we can only surmise what drove that. More people were online, there's no question about that. More people were using services and so exposed to a greater number of harms. But the number of reports increasing in relation to child exploitation material has been seen right through our partner network here and overseas. You will have seen from the AFP's submission, for example, that their reports from the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children in the US are about 65% higher than the same time last year. So it's difficult to answer that question with any degree of certainty. When it comes to the image-based abuse reports that concern under 18s, we've seen a shift in offender preferences that are now showing a origin offshore, primarily from places like the Philippines and West Africa, as part of a very organised criminal enterprise to target young people, vulnerable young people, with threats in order to generate a monetary benefit. That's being reported by our colleagues at the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. It's being reported by our colleagues at the Department of Justice in the United States and in the United Kingdom as well.
In the last session, we heard about an app called Roadblock, which my children are too old, so I didn't know about. Are there any other specific platforms or apps or anything that you are flagging as an increasing risk?
When it comes to platforms like Roblox and other interactive multiplayer sort of gaming environments or creation environments, we actually see those represented in a very slender way through our complaints data. That's not to say that there aren't concerns about the degree of moderation on those platforms and the safety issues that they present, but primarily we see represented in our data in terms of child sexual exploitation material, a distribution that focuses on the open web. I think a lot of public discourse around child exploitation material is that this is a problem that lives on the dark web. But while that's true, certainly for the purpose of creating new material and fostering communities of offenders who have a sexual interest in children, and I should say that is the domain of law enforcement, we don't intrude on that. The distribution of child abuse material is rife through the open web. So that's the part of the internet that we access using a browser. And the tendency for those wishing to distribute child abuse material is to create short-lived websites that intended for a very specific purpose to act as a source of material, knowing that those websites are going to be taken down in short order through the activities of regulators like the eSafety Commissioner and law enforcement. When it comes to the image-based abuse problem, we see a very high degree of reliance on social media platforms to initially contact children and young people under 18s. And then I think Mr. Zernsak was talking about the tendency of offenders to move their targets onto less monitored, less safe platforms, and that's certainly been our experience.
And do you actually track which of those platforms there are? Like, if you have a notification of a particular EARL, are you able to go back and actually say, well, this is how those children were contacted?
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
We are, and it's probably no surprise that the platforms that are preferred by offenders are the platforms that are preferred by children and young people. So they tend to be Instagram, Snapchat primarily, and that reflects patterns of usage more than anything else. And it's worth saying as well that we provide a lot of information to the likes of Meta and Snap to provide insight into what we're seeing and to allow them to take into account key indicators of compromise that are very specific to the kinds of methodologies that we see playing out in the complaints records.
Yeah. I asked the last people as well, the change in Twitter and the sacking of large numbers of staff, is that starting to play through in anything that you're seeing?
We haven't seen a noticeable increase in the number of reports about Twitter, but we find that there is often a lag between changes that are made within companies or to online safety policies and the way they tend to manifest in complaints. But you will know that the eSafety Commissioner wrote to CEO Elon Musk articulating several concerns. One of the people CC'd to that email was Yoel Roth, who at that point was the global head of trust and integrity, and it's unfortunate that Mr. Roth has left the company. So we are concerned. We are concerned about the what appears to be a dismantling of many of those core critical safety functions. And I think the point that the Safety Commissioner made in the letter is that it's not just the functions themselves that are relevant to how safety is practiced by the company, but how all of the components that contribute to the safety function operate, for example, in relation to ethical AI, but primarily for us in terms of local representation, ensuring that there is someone that we can actually get on the phone and have a conversation with and rely on as being a reliable conduit through to the trust and safety function, which is primarily operated in the United States.
Yeah, okay. One more question. You mentioned the short-term websites. So how are people, like, how is that information distributed to perpetrators or to, you know, I mean, how do they find these websites?
It's a question that I've wanted the answer to my entire career in this field. I've been doing this work for about 10 years. And when we think about what's involved in creating a website, there's money, there's time and there's resources. And we see time and time again that the patterns of distribution on the open web, from our perspective at least, haven't really shifted that much over about a decade. These websites live, they die, and then they're reborn somewhere else. At scale too, with astonishing frequency and with apparently very little involved in the effort that would normally be engaged in. So I'm not really sure what the answer to that question is. Okay. We see a lot of reliance on image hosting services that tend to be linked to from dark web sites. And we think that's probably because the Tor network, so that's the onion router network where a lot of this activity takes place, isn't a terribly fast network. And so to improve user experience, they tend to link out to open web sites like file hosts and image hosts. But what this really points to is the need for greater global coordination as well across jurisdictions, which has always been a challenge.
Before I go to someone else, just to follow up on that question, in relation, there's been some major rings that have been busted in terms of this material. To your knowledge, has the websites for that carriage been established in Australia, or have these been predominantly from overseas?
Thanks, Chair. We've had a takedown power in relation to Australian hosted material for the entire life of what was the online content scheme contained in the Broadcasting Services Act. So that was first enacted about 20 odd years ago. And since the commencement of the Children's eSafety Commissioner in July 2015, we haven't had the need to issue a removal notice or a takedown notice in relation to Australian hosted content. So I think it's fair to say that the interlocking regulatory and law enforcement mechanisms and frameworks that exist here are working well, but there's also a very high degree of maturity in the industry as well, and the industry take very, very rapid steps to ensure that any compromise of their networks for the purpose of sharing child abuse material are acted on quickly.
Can I have one more?
One more follow-up and then we'll go to Senator Shoebridge.
This concept of the short-term websites we've heard in other areas such as online gambling. Is there a mesh there? Are we talking about the same sorts of criminal entities that are doing the same sorts of behaviour, but in completely different markets, for want of a better word?
It's hard to answer that question definitively. I think that's probably a question that that law enforcement may be better positioned to answer. What we've seen through our own investigations, though, is that the domains and the particular indicators of hosting that we tend to see in the course of our investigations suggest much broader concerns in terms of content production and content distribution. So a network that is providing access to child abuse material is probably also providing access to highly offensive material like bestiality and pornography that sort of sits at the very upper edge of offensiveness. So they tend to have a fairly broad approach to distributing content as part of their enterprise.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Shoebridge?
Oh, thanks, Chair, and thanks for your attendance today. And Mr. Dagg, I want to thank your office for the work you do with the small resources you have to hand. I think your total staff is something in the order of 200, is that right?
That's right, Senator.
And that's full-time equivalent?
It's a mixture of contractors and APS staff.
All right. Perhaps you can give on notice what that mix is?
Yes, certainly. Happy to take that.
It's my understanding that since 2015, your office has finalised more than 61,000 investigations into child sexual exploitation material. Is that right?
It's all over. Our investigation output for the entire investigations branch is about 100,000 regulatory investigations, with the bulk of that, about 79,000, I think, comprising child exploitation material.
All right. Well, you said in correspondence to my office in October that there were some 61,000 investigations into CSEA material finalised since 2015.
I don't think that includes image-based abuse reports, though, Senator.
Right.
So.
What does finalise mean?
So that is a status which represents the end of an investigation. So an investigation commences when we receive a complaint, or we begin a known motion investigation based on a complaint. The Online Safety Act provides the Safety Commissioner with the power to initiate an investigation on her own recognizance. And the investigation is finalised once we take an action such as making a referral into the Global InHope network for takedown within the host jurisdiction.
All right. And do you know what the outcomes are? For example, have there been any domestic penalties issued or any domestic compliance action taken?
Under the Online Safety Act, Senator, no, we have not issued any formal notices to Australian entities, and we haven't enforced any of our actions through civil penalties. I will say, though, that we have taken a number of actions under the image-based abuse scheme to require information from companies, and we've issued some remedial directions as well to perpetrators of image-based abuse.
So I suppose I'm finding it hard to work out with 100,000 complaints how not one of them has led to an actual enforcement or an actual penalty. That seems hard to square for me, given the kind of material we've heard and the concerns we've heard raised.
Yeah,
Can you shed some light on that?
When it comes to the actions that we've taken under the online content scheme, we have a cooperative arrangement in place with the Australian Federal Police that provides us with the power to notify offshore hosted child abuse material to the InHope network. So about 96 or 97% of all of the finalised child sexual exploitation material matters that come through our investigations team are notified to InHope, because InHope is a global network that includes a footprint in North America, Western Europe, and those tend to be the places where content is predominantly hosted. The benefit of doing that rather than issuing Class 1 removal notices under the Act is that it's far more effective and efficient for us to rely on those local mechanisms for removal in the host jurisdiction rather than trying to tackle that through formal regulatory notices. It's much faster.
But that still leaves thousands, I don't know whether it's 3,000 or 4,000, that aren't overseas, that are domestic.
No, they're not domestic, they're just not contained within the InHope network. So that might be hosting in Ukraine, for example, or China. In those cases, we notify those to the Australian Federal Police.
All right. And what about, do you have any idea of the numbers that are domestically sourced?
We haven't seen a single instance of child abuse material being hosted here since before 2015.
Could I ask you then about the actions you are able to take in terms of takedown notices? If material's coming from overseas, you can issue a takedown notice if any of the material's hosted in Australia, is that right?
Or if the service has an Australian connection, so if the material is provided via an Australian service with an Australian connection.
Yeah, so can you explain to me the extent of your powers if there's that Australian connection or an Australian hosting?
Both provide us with the ability to issue a removal notice. So, for example, in the case of a company that has an Australian director, for example, or has a domain architecture that is registered here, that might provide us with the necessary connection with Australia to enable a removal notice.
Yeah, but that's about individual instances of material, isn't it?
Yes, it is, yes.
So what if you have an entity like KiwiFarms.net that is a serial, constant, repeat offender? What are your powers in relation to an entity like that? It's just individual takedown notices, is that right?
Well, I'm not sure I could recall a specific instance of child exploitation material being provided via Kiwi Farms, Senator, but if we were to assume for the sake of argument that was the case, then yes, the power is for us to issue a removal notice in relation to material, and material is typically identified as a result of a uniform resource locator, so a URL string.
Yeah, so, and we'll use Kiwi Farms as an example because it's one that's been discussed broadly, more in relation to other offensive behaviour and doxing and other toxic behaviour. But for example, you don't have statutory powers to seize the network block. In that case, that comes from, I think, Flow Chemical Limited.
No,
you can't
no.
seize a network block.
No.
That would, though, be an effective way of stopping it, though, wouldn't it? If you had a persistent offender.
Senator, being able to seize an entire network block could have a range of collateral impacts that would need to be very, very carefully considered. Mm-hmm. In that particular instance, my understanding from discussions with AP-NIC, which is responsible for actually providing the network block, was that in terms of the company details provided to them through the course of the application, which we understand came from Flow Chemical, all was in order. So that strays well beyond our powers, and the impact on the broader internet would need to be given very serious consideration.
Well, but you don't have the power to order APNIC, that's the Asia Pacific Network Information Centre, to withdraw any entity's authority to advertise on an IP block either, do you?
No, we do not.
But that surely would be useful if you've got a persistent offender.
Senator, I think, as I said before, dealing with entire IP addresses and entire IP blocks could have very large collateral effects, given the fact that it's often the case that a single IP address is the IP address supporting hundreds, if not thousands, of domains. And I think we just need to give that very serious consideration.
But you see, I suppose what concerns me is your powers are limited to kind of whack-a-mole powers, knocking down individual offensive content, but you can't take out the players if you find them.
Our experience has been that when it comes to issuing removal notices, Because we also have the power to issue those notices to hosting service providers, when it comes to child exploitation material, will often remove the entire domain. So we don't see very much benefit operationally in targeting our Class 1 removal notices to the operators of a child abuse material website. That would be absurd on its face. So instead we target hosting service providers, and the hosting service providers, because they're often reputable companies, will generally act quickly against the entire domain.
But they're not required to, are they? They're only required to take down the individual offensive URLs that you identify.
The specific compliance responsibilities are related to the material specified in the notice.
So you rely upon the goodwill or the ethical response of the local providers to take down the whole domain. It's not the power you have.
We don't have a power to take down an entire domain. No, to issue a removal notice in relation to an entire domain.
Well,
no.
Surely that would be helpful, wouldn't it?
Senator Bridget Gannon from the department. I suppose the policy framing for these powers is that the Online Safety Act in the first instance is designed to expect platforms and internet services to take action to remove the content, and the Online Safety Act acts as a safety net where they refuse to do so. In this particular space, there is that interaction with the criminal law where we then look at whether the AFP has powers to take criminal action against people running sites that have a dominant purpose of disseminating this criminal material.
But the best protection, if you've got an offensive domain, is to take out the domain, not to just take out the individual offending material. And I don't know why you're resistant to that proposition.
There are powers under the Online Safety Act to have link deletion and app deletion notices issued. So if an app or a service search engine providers, you can give them a notice to block those links in the apps.
But
There's
that's
also,
different, as
that's right.
Gannon. You're talking about a different matter.
That's
so
right.
I come back to my initial proposition.
Senator, one of the risks that arises when one thinks about a power to take down an entire domain, even one as egregious as Kiwi Farms, is the potential impact on material that doesn't meet a threshold of removal, which, if you think about the operational impact on an agency like the Safety Commissioner, would require us to effectively audit the entire site to ensure that we weren't taking action that wasn't disproportionate.
Well, if you found repeat, egregious, offensive behaviour harming Australians, harming young people, coming from a particular domain, it seems to me that that kind of risk analysis should err on the side of protecting people who are being repeatedly, systemically harmed by a domain like Kiwi Farms.
I understand the position.
Yeah. And your position is, well, you'd have to search the whole domain to find if there was any worthy material to allow the offensive, egregiously offensive material to remain. It would be a balancing strategy. Is that your proposition?
We would have to take a balancing approach in order to determine whether or not there were public policy impacts that couldn't be sustained by a power like that.
Well, I'm not entirely sure I agree with you, but I suppose we're not here to have that policy debate.
Any further questions? Otherwise, we'll go to someone else.
On a different issue. But I'll come
Okay.
back to it.
Dan?
Of the 15,500 reports, how many were passed on to the AFP?
So about 70% of all reports concern child abuse material, and they led to about 11,500 regulatory investigations into child sexual abuse material that were finalised as child sexual abuse material. We find that it's not uncommon to receive complaints about child abuse material where, when we review the material, it doesn't meet the threshold of child abuse material. It's often pornographic content that contains younger performers who appear to be in their late adolescence, but when we look at the sexual characteristics, for example, it's clear that they are in fact adults. Those outcomes lead, as I was explaining to Senator Shoebridge, to two actions. One primarily is reporting into the InHope network, and through the Australian Federal Police Memorandum of Understanding, we're able to make those referrals into the InHope network without specifically notifying them to the AFP. There's then a small number of URLs that we notify to the AFP that fall outside of the InHope network. But the arrangement that we have in place with the AFP as well sets out some very clear parameters in terms of flagging matters to them that concern Australian victims and Australian offenders, and we pass that information on for both intelligence purposes and to ensure that we're managing risk. And that's particularly the case in under 18s image-based abuse matters, where we confer with the Australian Federal Police on a near daily basis.
Yep, okay. Thank you. And once an image is online and you guys have deemed it that it's a correct report and that you want to finalise the report and you ask that image to be removed, how is that image actually removed? Because once it's there, it could be anywhere.
That's certainly one of the risks of content appearing in digital form on the internet. The focus on taking action in relation to image-based abuse matters concerning under 18s is particularly focused on that aspect of the potential consequences that might be experienced by victims and targets of what we're seeing to be very much organised crime activities targeting those on various social media platforms. When it comes to the actual practical mechanics of removal, working with social media services, we see them act quickly on accounts that are contacting young people for the purpose or sharing material without consent. And in the financial year 21 to 22, we took action on about 3,500 accounts through notifying social media services that that was the case.
Thank you.
Okay, before we go to Mr O'Brien, I just want to talk about the issue, this is probably more from the states, but the department, but state jurisdictions having different legislation, different laws. What's the department done in terms of trying to align so that we can get the states falling in line with the federal responsibilities that we have?
You mean in terms of the criminal laws in the states and territories?
Yes.
That would be a question better directed to the Attorney General's department. The Department of Infrastructure has policy responsibility for the Online Safety Act, which is a Commonwealth matter.
Right, so in terms of that act, is there any further work that needs to be done in that area after it's been in operation for some time now? Has there been a review as to whether or not that needs to be strengthened?
The Online Safety Act.
Yes.
The Online Safety Act has been reviewed over the past and revised over the last few years, and it actually commenced in January this year. So it is an updated piece of legislation now, and the Safety Commissioners and her office are in the process of implementing that legislation.
Yes, Mr. Dave, would you like to comment on the updated version? Is it still adequate or is it a moving feast?
Chair, we've found the improved powers to be effective. Prior to the Online Safety Act's commencement, when the online content scheme was contained in the Broadcasting Services Act, our takedown powers were limited to Australian-hosted material, which meant that there was little we could do other than act informally. While we haven't issued removal notices in relation to child sexual exploitation material in Australia, we have issued removal notices under the Online Safety Act, in particular following the Buffalo terror attack in May this year. The content that we saw was hosted overseas. Some of it was hosted on Kiwi farms, to be precise. And we found that those removal notices were effective in about 2/3 of cases. We then, and this is an illustration of how the legislation can work to tackle this kind of content. To Ms Gannon's point, we then used our ancillary powers under the Act to issue link deletion notices to Google and to have the links removed from the Bing service operated by Microsoft as well.
Just one final question from me. In terms of end-to-end encryption, that's been deemed from the submissions that we've received, that's going to make the job of detection more difficult. Do yourself or the department have any comments in relation to that, or what steps are being taken to override that situation?
We share the concerns of some of our stakeholders in the in-home network, such as the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children in the US and our law enforcement partners at the Commonwealth level about the potential impact of end-to-end encryption on the capacity for actionable information about victims to be taken forward. So out of the 29 million reports made to the National Centre last year, a very considerable number of those, about 22 million I think, were made by Facebook, Facebook Messenger particularly. The concern has long been, and the Safety Commissioner co-authored an op-ed in The Australian with Detective Inspector John Rouse from the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation on this topic last year. The issue has always been for us about ensuring that industry is taking adequate steps to mitigate the risks to children and young people from moving to an end-to-end encrypted model. Now, it remains to be seen whether or not the steps that are being taken by industry to address that will be effective. But we know from reports from colleagues overseas that reports into the National Centre have led to rescues of children. That's been the case here, it's been the case overseas. So yes, we are concerned. In terms of the sort of legislative issues and the policy issue, that's probably a better question for the department.
Yeah. And again, we share that concern. My understanding is that there is some work to look at that issue coming out of the Department of Home Affairs. In the online safety space, we look to the basic online safety expectations where there's a legislative instrument that sets out the government's expectations of what platforms and services will do to keep their users safe, and that they're then required to report to the eSafety Commissioner on request about how they're meeting those expectations and whether they're meeting those expectations. Among those expectations, while it doesn't specifically target encryption, it does say, well, if you don't know who your users are, what are you doing to make sure that they're using the platforms in a safe way? And that if you can't look at their content, what's the other information that you as a service have that can prevent this information and data being exchanged in the future? There are the BOS requests for reports went out recently, and I think the responses have been received by eSafety for the first round of notices under the basic online safety expectations. It's important to note that eSafety can't fine companies for failing to meet the expectations. They can only issue a notice if they've failed to report. So it is about transparency and understanding what platforms are doing and indeed pushing them to do more to provide a safe online environment.
And we're keen as well to use the BOS powers going forward to test some of those issues around encryption. There is a specific component of the basic online safety expectations in the relevant instrument that permits us the power to ask questions about how encryption might be impacting user safety.
I think in light of the recent issues that have come to light in relation to Optus and Medibank, there's a lot more interest from the public. So, and I think they'll be looking for government to show the leadership on a whole range of issues in relation to the internet. Mr. O'Brien.
Thanks, Chair. Most of my questions were covered off by Dan, but thanks, mate. But I'm just a little bit more interested in that memorandum of understanding with the AFP and when referrals actually happen. You said it happens on a daily basis. What thresholds are there that activates a referral to the AFP? Obviously, that will be increasing with the level of increase of referrals that you're getting. If you could speak to me about those aspects, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, Deputy, will do. The role played by the Safety Commissioner in relation to these matters is one that complements and supports law enforcement. I think that's a really important statement to make up front. The main degree of contact that we have with the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation is in that under-18s image-based abuse space, where we're seeing evidence of sexual extortion or grooming in particular. We take a shared risk approach to dealing with those kinds of matters with the AFP, and we're very conscious of the primacy of the AFP in in this area. All of our public communications recently have been around reinforcing that point that those who are concerned, whether they're the target of this kind of abuse or someone acting on their behalf, like a parent or carer, those who are concerned about that kind of harm should be contacting the Australian Federal Police as their first port of call. We'll always receive a residual number of those complaints made by children who feel uncomfortable about reporting to the police, who are concerned about their parents finding out. We take a child rights approach to dealing with those kinds of matters. Just to give you some information about the operational arrangements that we have in place that sit alongside the MOU, we are bound by the the Commonwealth Child Safe Framework, and we have a child safety policy in place which really stipulates how we are to manage that relationship with the AFP, and it intersects with the MOU. So effectively, the teams that are dealing with this kind of issue are bound by mandatory reporting obligations as well. So in addition to reporting to the AFP, if a child appears to come from a jurisdiction that has mandatory reporting obligations in place, we'll also notify relevant child protection authorities. In terms of the operational arrangements that we have in place, they're set out in the MOU, and they set a number of thresholds for us to turn our minds to. They're thresholds which are reasonably high, and so we take a precautionary approach to ensuring that we're sharing as much information with the AFP as possible about the matters that children are coming to us if they give concern about potential grooming activity, if they show concern about being targeted by some of these offshore groups who are engaged in sexual extortion. If there are those kinds of child protection issues that arise, then we're picking up the phone to the Child Protection Triage Unit at the ACE and having a conversation with them about what we've seen, and we do pass over matters to them for investigation as circumstances require.
And child offenders, specifically, how do you deal with those if you suspect that it's not a high-end cartel or somebody organised and it is just another child offender, someone
Yes.
under the age of even 16?
There have been times when we've identified Australian offenders in images and videos that we've been reviewing through the course of taking action against complaints about child abuse material. In those cases, if we can put that person to a specific jurisdiction, we'll use the MOUs that we have in place with state and territory police to contact the relevant joint anti-child exploitation team and notify them. But otherwise, we'll make the referral onto the ACE through an intelligence report. Most of those working in this area at eSafety are former law enforcement. I'm former law enforcement. The head of the investigations branch is former law enforcement. We've got a mixture of AFP, New South Wales Police and others. And so we're well attuned to what law enforcement needs as a result of that information sharing process. And we're doing more in the way of formal intelligence exchange with law enforcement in this area too.
No, thanks. Thanks,
Senator
Chair.
Shoebridge.
Oh, thanks, Chair. I think it was the 29th of August, although it was reported on the 30th of August, the eSafety Commissioner issued legal notices to some big tech companies seeking a response on what measures they were taking to tackle child sexual exploitation materials. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that went to Apple, Meta, Microsoft, Snap and Omegle. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. We also issued notices to WhatsApp, which is owned by Meta but a separate corporate entity, and Skype, which likewise is owned by Microsoft but a separate corporate entity.
But did not issue it to Amazon in relation to Twitch. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. Those 7 were the first to be targeted by the notices.
The US National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children says reports of apparent child sexual abuse on Twitch increased by 1,125% between 2019 and 2021. There was a highly publicised report on, I think, Bloomberg about some 279,000 children, at least, from that fairly small study being potentially exposed to predatory accounts by adults. Are you aware of that body of concern and research?
Yes, I am.
So I can't understand why Twitch wasn't included in the notices that were issued on the 29th of August, given that Twitch basically targets teenagers and young people through live gaming and streaming services? I can't work out why Twitch wasn't targeted.
Well, one of the most important explanations, Senator, is that when preparing notices under the basic online safety expectations, the Commissioner needs to take into account, among other things, the number of complaints made to the Commissioner in relation to that particular service. So in terms of formulating this list, we had regard to our own complaints data. We also had regard to input from a number of other stakeholders within government, in particular the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. And as a consequence of those kinds of engagements and our assessment of the legislative criteria against our data, we formulated that list.
But surely the job of the eSafety Commissioner is to get ahead of the curve, not wait for the complaints to happen and then try and remediate it. I mean, the US is ahead of the curve. They're seeing this surge of complaints in relation to Twitch. Is the eSafety Commission's response they're going to wait for the complaints to occur in Australia, wait for the abuse to start happening before they issue the notice? Is that actually the idea?
No, not at all. And in fact, if you look at the list that was prepared for the purpose of informing the eSafety Commissioner to issue those notices, some of the most concerning services that have been on the radar of child protection authorities around the world have included the likes of Omegle. The information from the Australian Federal Police is that Skype is routinely used in order to facilitate live stream child sexual exploitation.
Mr. Dack, I have no issue at all with you raising concerns with the likes of Apple, Meta, Microsoft, Snap and Omegle. You're pushing against an open door there. Well done, that's good. But for the life of me, I can't work out why you didn't include Amazon Twitch. And is it simply you're waiting for the complaints to come in before you take proactive action?
No, these were prioritised on the basis of our assessment of our data in part against those statutory criteria. And it's worth saying too, Senator, that this was just the first wave of BOST notices too. There are subsequent waves coming and we'll be instituting periodic reporting notices in due course.
Can you provide to the Committee on Notice the actual notices that were issued to those entities?
I'll need to take that on notice and give consideration. If we can provide that, we certainly will.
Well, I mean, I'm assuming they're of a fairly standard type. You've worked out what the questions are, you've worked out what the issues are, and there's a degree of similarity between what you're asking Apple, Meta, Microsoft, Snap and Omegle.
There may be some information in those notices, Senator, that we'll just need to consider in terms of confidentiality.
Well, but what I'm putting to you is this. You've basically got the kind of information you want settled in this various correspondence. What are the extra resources in simply asking the same of another global platform that we know is targeted by predatory accounts like Twitch? What's the resistance?
There's no resistance, Senator. This was a list that was formulated, as I said, on our assessment of statutory criteria, our own data, and input from a number of key stakeholders, most notably the Australian Federal Police.
And are you saying there were no complaints from the AFP in relation to Twitch?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that this list is prioritised on the basis of that input.
Can you provide us, if you've got the material now, what level of complaints, what numbers of complaints there are in relation to Twitch that eSafety Commission has received?
I'm happy to take that on notice.
I note that I think it was the 8th of this month, wasn't it, that the eSafety Commissioner wrote to Twitter?
Yes, that's right. Just the same day as the Senate estimates appearance.
Yeah, and today I think there was some, that was on the day of Senate estimates appearance,
yes,
is that right?
That's right?
And today there was an article in the SMH about the work of the eSafety Commissioner?
Yes, that's right.
Yep. What is your intent in relation to the correspondence that you sent to Elon Musk and Twitter? What's your regulatory intent with sending that?
The main intent behind that correspondence was to establish who should be our local interface with the company. Several of our local contacts moved on from the company, and there was a lack of information about who we should be directly dealing with as a regulator in terms of policy representatives here. That was the most critical part of that letter, but also getting a sense of how Twitter is addressing the totality of its online safety capabilities was another key component, thinking through the potential regulatory impacts on the eSafety Commissioner and the Australian public from a failure in that regard.
There's no legal requirement on Twitter to even respond to that correspondence, is there?
No.
And you don't have the power to issue an audit of the e-safety procedures of Twitter?
We can issue Twitter with a notice under the basic online safety expectations, potentially. That would be an option that might be open to us. Again, assessing those notices against the relevant criteria, but the basic online safety expectations are designed to ensure a degree of transparency around some of those key user safety issues.
But in relation to the 8th of November correspondence, you send the letter, there's no statutory obligation for Twitter to respond. They've sacked most of the people who probably should respond. So what is your expectations?
Well, happily, we've had some productive conversations with Twitter since then, both their local and regional representatives. So I'm pleased to say that we've re-established those connections.
So you have someone to answer the phone?
Yes.
Can you identify who that is and what their role is in Twitter? If not who that is, what their role is, what's their seniority?
Senator, that's not information I will be able to provide to the committee immediately.
In terms of the level of your concerns regarding Twitter, given the repeated reports, for example, of deeply offensive pornographic material being, side by side with Twitter ads, repeated reports of concerns of that, how high is your level of concern in relation to Twitter, given the cuts we've seen?
Well, as I said, I think to the Chair, we haven't seen a marked increase in the number of reports made to us publicly concerning Twitter. So we're taking a watching brief, but at this stage we haven't seen those reports manifest in a particular increase in harms.
But again, we come back to the reactive approach. If your answer is you're just waiting for the complaints to come in before you identify the nature of the problem or the seriousness of the problem, we come back to that reactive problem, don't we, Mr. Dack?
We can't police the internet, Senator, and Twitter is an enormous service. I think there is something in the order of 500 million tweets or even more posted each day. We do need to wait for complaints in order to provide us with an investigative hook. Otherwise, we'd be attempting to search out all known harms on all known services, and that's impossible.
But we know from report after report after report, I could send you a whole bunch of prominent news reports of Twitter's posting of child pornography next to a whole series of corporate ads, which have led to a whole lot of corporates withdraw their advertising from Twitter. We know that there's a serious problem with Twitter, don't we?
Well, Senator, if you have information about specific items being posted to Twitter that amount to child exploitation material, we'd very much like to hear from
I'm happy
your
to
office.
send you the public reports from Al Jazeera, from BBC, these aren't hidden under a rock. And my office, I can show you, is smaller than yours.
But, Senator, I think the important thing is that those public reports aren't specific in terms of providing us with information about accounts and locations. There's no investigative avenue that's opened up as a result of public reporting by the likes of Al Jazeera in terms of how harms might be manifesting on Twitter.
They identify the companies and they identify that have withdrawn their advertising. All you need to do is send a letter to them and ask them to provide the materials about the concern. But you don't do that, you wait for a complaint.
The system that has been established under the Online Safety Act, Senator, is a public reporting system.
So I suppose we come back to the nature of the office, which is it's a reactive office based on what I would describe as a whack-a-mole response, where you have to have a sufficient number of complaints, a sufficient amount of disturbing behaviour before the e-Safety Commissioner starts acting. That's the regulatory model, isn't it?
It's true to say that our responses to complaints, our investigative responses to complaints are based on complaints. But as I said earlier, we have the power to use our own initiative based on complaints because we like I said before, we can't police the internet, to then investigate further and obtain information about as much child exploitation material as possible. So to the extent that we play a game of whack-a-mole, that's true of the entire global response to child exploitation material. And we play an important part of an international network of countries around the world that are focusing on child exploitation material, a network that exchanged in excess of 1 million reports in 2021. And that joined-up approach is improving over time, but it will take time to strengthen.
Questions? I have a couple if I could. we've focused on obviously the concerns and the negativity about child abuse material being so readily available. Are there any new technological apps or technology that helps to identify this material?
Thanks, Janet. The mainstay of detecting child abuse material for about the last decade has been a technology called PhotoDNA, and that was developed in partnership between Microsoft and Dartmouth University, and it is intended to provide a means of discovering at scale the fingerprints of previously identified items of child exploitation material. So that's been instituted now in several hundred companies. All of the major social media platforms use PhotoDNA or some other image detection tool based on a list of signatures or fingerprints that are provided by the likes of the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. We've seen some excellent work being done by the not-for-profit sector, such as the Canadian Centre for Child Protection in Winnipeg. They've been responsible for driving through some major developments in the scaled automatic detection of child abuse material across the internet through their Project Arachnid initiative. We've also seen the likes of Thorn make some significant inroads in terms of grooming detection technology, which have now been incorporated into their Safer product, which is provided through the AWS store. So these are just some examples of where the tech sector is starting to grapple with providing tools for widespread adoption. We know as well that the likes of Google and Facebook have open sourced a number of their tools to enable companies to better detect child exploitation material, but most importantly assist in their detection of probable child abuse material, which is first generation content. We are very intent, as I'm sure you've seen, on promoting safety by design as a basic principle that should drive all new online services and in fact be retrofitted to existing online services. And part of the safety by design framework is built around trust and safety. We do expect a significant degree of investment from companies in trust and safety because while technologies are important in providing a scaled response to this enormous and growing problem, having human staff who are capable of developing an understanding of the problem, becoming subject matter experts, working to protect their users, and most importantly, acting as a conduit for information out to the likes of law enforcement and regulators is really essential.
So in terms of child exploitation and from time to time and too regularly we hear reports through the media and within our own communities that young adolescents are actually sharing intimate photos that they've taken with their partner, and then next thing you know it's right through a school campus. How much of your work is focused on making young people more aware of once you put something out there, you've lost control of where that ends up? How much of your work is involved in that area?
There's a considerable amount of material that we've produced, Chair, on that very topic, on the question of better managing risk, particularly given the easily shared nature of digital content. So the safety.gov.au website provides a very extensive youth section, and there's a concentration on both image-based abuse and sexual extortion. And I differentiate the two because image-based abuse, when it comes to peer sharing, I think needs to be seen as fundamentally different to sexual extortion. About 12% of all of the reports we get about image-based abuse concern peer sharing, and about 30% of all reports we receive are from under 18s. An example of an initiative that we've just funded through the Online Safety Grants Program is the initiative that's being undertaken by Sexual Health Victoria to start to talk to younger school children about the risks inherent to sharing intimate material. And we're really starting to see some of that discourse penetrate. So our statistics are showing more and more that when young people are faced with the situation of either receiving unwanted material or knowing that someone has done something to make them feel uncomfortable online, including sharing their material without consent, they'll take action. So it's good to see through some of our research, such as the Mind the Gap report, that about 90% of young people now are taking some kind of positive action in relation to that. But what we do want to see is a far greater number of young people turning to their parent or to their carer for assistance. That still remains lower than we'd like it to be.
And do you make available to all high schools, for instance, and even upper primary school, that this information is available? Is it just left to people to find that information themselves, or are you proactive in getting into the education?
Very much proactively getting it out there through various avenues. We oversee a program known as the Trusted eSafety Provider Program, where we accredit providers of online safety education to go into schools and to deliver seminars on online safety. They promote the Safety Commissioner as a source of reliable information, and we're closing in on 1 million sessions delivered by the Trusted eSafety Provider Network. We also run webinars with school children across the country almost on a daily basis. There have been several 100,000 run over the last 12 months or so. We also inform pre-service and in-service teacher training to reinforce the role of the online safety regulator and to have online safety inculcated as part of the curriculum.
One final question, because we're due to break. In relation to our previous witnesses, I'm not sure if you were in the room at the time, but they spoke about this issue as being, should be dealt with as a health issue, and I just wondered what your views were in relation to, we all strongly believe it's a crime, but in terms of how would you perceive it being dealt with as a health issue when people actually have a potential that is driven by a health condition as to why they access this type of material?
I think it's often been said that we can't arrest our way out of this problem, but nor can we regulate our way out of this problem. And taking a prevention-first approach is fundamental to the way the eSafety Commissioner operates. That's targeting the general populace through the sort of public health model of general awareness, and then also focusing on those cohorts that are at risk or particularly vulnerable to exploitation and abuse online with information, prevention information. We're also supportive of efforts to create mechanisms by which those who are likely to access child abuse material are provided prevention messaging and an opportunity to disclose what's happening in their lives for the purpose of being diverted away from that path. And there's a very pleasing pilot which is being conducted in Australia that is based on the Stop It Now model, and we're in the community of advisors that help guide that program.
Would you be able to provide that on notice, the material? That would be excellent. Anything from you, Ms. Gann, in relation to the department's view?
No, I don't think we have anything further to add, Chair, but thank you.
Can I thank you all for appearing before us and your submission, and as with the previous witnesses, we appreciate what you do on a daily basis, and thank you very much, and we will stand adjourned until 10:35.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I now welcome representation from the Australian Federal Police, including the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation and the Attorney General's Department, including the National Office of Child Safety. The Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to a superior officer or to a minister. This resolution does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. I understand that the information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to a Senate committees has been provided to you for the Hansard record. Will you please state your full names and capacity in which you are appearing today? And then I understand that the Office of the Attorney General's Department will will prefer to make a first opening statement. So I now ask you if you could all identify yourselves for the record, and then we'll go into your opening statements.
Thank you. Tara Inverarity, First Assistant Secretary, International and Security Cooperation Division.
Rebecca Kilpatrick, Assistant Secretary, National Office for Child Safety.
Adam Knott, Assistant Secretary, Cybercrime and Cross-Border Data Branch.
Stephen D'Amato, Acting Assistant Commissioner, Northern Command with the AFP.
And Commander Hilda Sirik for the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation and Human Exploitation.
Thank you very much. Who's going to start from the department?
That's quite okay. Angela Brown, Director of the Child Abuse Policy Section in the Cybercrime and Cross-Border Data Branch. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have just a brief opening statement. The Attorney General's Department welcomes the opportunity to appear before the committee as part of its inquiry into law enforcement capabilities in relation to child sexual exploitation. This is the first time the department has appeared for this inquiry following the machinery of government changes in line with the 1st of June 2022 Administrative Arrangements Order. Those changes included the transfer of child sexual abuse and other criminal justice and law enforcement policy functions into the Attorney General's Department from the Department of Home Affairs, and the National Office of Child Safety also transferred into the Attorney General's Department from the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. Australia is committed to being a global leader in responding to child sexual abuse. The Commonwealth has comprehensive legislative frameworks for child sexual abuse committed overseas and via a postal or carriage service, and passed important reforms in 2019 and 2020. Australia's law enforcement capabilities are world-class, and we continue to strengthen them, including as a result of efforts through the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. Innovative and ambitious reforms are also being pursued via the National Strategy to Prevent and Respond to Child Sexual Abuse 2021 to 2030, which was launched in October 2021. The National Strategy is Australia's first nationally coordinated strategic framework for preventing and responding to child sexual abuse in all settings, including online, within families and in organisations. It was a key recommendation of the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, and itself responds to approximately 100 additional recommendations. Australian, state and territory governments are delivering the national strategy through a series of action plans, with the first 2 action plans running from 2021 to 2024. Measures to enhance law enforcement capabilities and disrupt child sexual abuse primarily sit under National Strategy Action Plan Theme 4, Offender Prevention and Intervention. The first action plan, Theme 4 measures, have been allocated a total of $167 million under the National Strategy's first 4 years. The National Office for Child Safety oversees national strategy implementation, and the Attorney General's Department is responsible for delivering approximately 35 of the National Strategy's initial 62 measures. Responding to this crime type requires a multifaceted response and cross-sector and cross-border engagement. The department is actively working with law enforcement, policymakers, industry and other key stakeholders to identify cross-sector challenges and opportunities to prevent, detect and disrupt online child sexual abuse and better support victims and survivors. We are reviewing relevant Commonwealth offences and continue to work to ensure appropriate powers for law enforcement agencies. We're also working to achieve expedited international cooperation processes to obtain cross-border evidence through the implementation of the agreement between the Government of Australia and the Government of the United States of America on access to electronic data for the purpose of countering serious crime. We continue to work with industry and international partners on implementation and uptake of the 5-country ministerial voluntary principles to counter online child sexual exploitation and abuse, and to ensure digital services proactively prevent, detect and eliminate online harms before they occur. We are doing a lot, but technology and offending methodologies evolve quickly, posing new and complex challenges and risks to children. It's critical that we keep pace and that the response from governments and industry alike reflects the community's high expectations around online child protection and the scale of risk children and parents are facing online. Our future challenges and priorities include better supporting and empowering victims and survivors, addressing emerging forms of offending such as the online extortion of children in a child abuse context, evidence-based methods of offender prevention and intervention to stop abuse before it occurs and prevent reoffending, and ensuring Australia has a strong framework of offences and that law enforcement have the tools, capabilities and access to data they need. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear today.
Thank you.
Chair, if the AFP can do an opening statement. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the opportunity to appear today as part of the continuation of this inquiry. As this is the AFP's first formal public appearance before the new committee, I would like to acknowledge the important role of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Law Enforcement in examining trends and changes in criminal activity and law enforcement's ability to respond. The AFP welcomes opportunities to support these important inquiries to ensure that our capabilities are fit for purpose to tackle the continuing evolving threat environment. I think we all agree that one victim of child abuse is one too many. Our ultimate goal is that all children are free from exploitation, and we continue to prioritise a range of prevention initiatives to try and achieve this. It's important to ensure the committee is aware the AFP plays a critical, complementary and collaborative role with key partners, particularly our state and territory police. The AFP, together with our partners, continue to work at the local, national and international levels to coordinate a full suite of expertise, resources and technology to swiftly combat these threats and protect the community. Established in September 2018, the AFP-led ACE brings together law enforcement, public and private sectors and civil society to drive a national response to deter, disrupt and prevent child exploitation. The prevalence of child exploitation offending continues to increase. In the last financial year, the ACE Child Protection Triage Unit received more than 36,000 reports of child sexual exploitation. In the 2021-22 financial year, the AFP charged 221 offenders with 1,746 charges for child abuse. The threats, trend and gaps we identified at the end of 2021 remain accurate today. Australians are committing grave offences offshore. As the impacts of COVID-19 start to lessen and international borders reopen, the AFP expect individuals will travel offshore to contact offend. We anticipate this will include a number of Australians whose offending was previously limited to the online world only. The AFP's international network will be pivotal in combating this upwards trend. Recently, the AFP, together with the National Police of the Netherlands and the US Justice Department, supported an investigation led by Philippines law enforcement into international child abuse and trafficking. This resulted in an Australian man being sentenced to 129 years in imprisonment. The content created by this man, together with the 3 co-accused, is some of the most horrific imagery that law enforcement have uncovered to date. The significant sentence he received highlights the importance of collaborative efforts and existing international partnerships to combat child exploitation. Offenders perpetrating child abuse benefit significantly from technological advancements. They are highly adaptable and will rapidly adopt new approaches to facilitate their criminal activity. For example, an emerging trend observed by the AFP and the ACE is the significant increase in the number of online sexual extortion reports. Referred to as sextortion is an emerging crime type and is a convergence of organised financial crime with child sexual abuse and exploitation. Over 100 children report each month to Australian law enforcement that they are victim of sextortion, and analysis confirms this is a fraction of the real number. Sextortion thrives on creating fear and apprehension in young victims and, like most child exploitation, adapts to evade law enforcement identification, disruption and prevention. Despite the prevalence of online child abuse offending more broadly, research shows that only 52% of parents talk to their children about online safety. To combat this, the ACE and the AFP have developed a picture book to help start conversations about being safe online. The ACE and the AFP education program, Think You Know, have recently released the book, Jack Changes the Game. The book aims to help families and school groups to start age-appropriate conversations about online grooming. The book is based on a real report to the ACE and is supported by an academic reference group of experts in child protection and education. The book is complemented by Think You Know learning package, including teacher lesson plans and at-home learning for families. The AFP is preparing to distribute this book to more than 8,000 primary schools across Australia. Opening the conversation is vital to preventing this crime type from continuing. Thank you again for inviting the AFP to appear today, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of them. Mr. O'Brien.
Yeah, thanks everyone for appearing before us today, and I want to start off just by making an acknowledgement of those who work at the coalface on this issue and detecting and investigating these crimes. As a former police officer of 16 years, I can only imagine how difficult it is, particularly in relation to some of these horrendous offences that have to, and the evidence that has to be observed. So to those people, we as a society owe them a huge debt of gratitude. We heard evidence before about hosting and of child sexual exploitation material, and there hasn't been any in Australia hosted or detected for some years. But that obviously doesn't mean that there's not material being produced here and disseminated overseas. Can you give me a bit of a snapshot on what Australia is facing in terms of actual production of this sort of material domestically here in Australia?
Well, thank you for the question. In regard to hosting, we are certainly seeing, as I said in my opening statement, that increase in that online sexual exploitation, where kids are being groomed to create, I suppose, material themselves, which are then used to exploit it against them for financial gain. We're seeing about 100 reports a month in regards to being to law enforcement, but that would be underreporting, because there would be a lot of times that would not, there are a lot of people that would not report that crime. So in that sense, certainly seen some of that online activity coming from Australia in regards to hosting. I might just pass on to my colleague about some of the other threats that we're seeing.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Yeah, I think the broader issue is that we know that online child sexual exploitation is a borderless crime. Offenders are very adept at using anonymising technologies, other aspects such as virtual private networks and the like. So the scale of the offending here, what's produced in Australia and globally, is quite I suppose, a global mess of online child exploitation. We work really closely with a lot of the companies and platforms where they use those platforms to disseminate child abuse material, and I have to say that Australia is not immune to offenders disseminating child abuse material, notably by the statistics that highlight that just here in Australia in the last financial year, 221 people were charged with either possession or production of child abuse material. The big thing about that as well is that because the material is so prevalent online, offenders can share across each other. They share this material. It might not necessarily be an Australian-based victim. It could be a Southeast Asia-based victim series. It could be from the UK. And all those series are shared in large caches of materials. And child sex offenders use that material as their kind of commodity in terms of further dissemination across the board. The other aspect is the prevalence of the techniques and tactics and sharing of abuse material through the darknet as well, which is highly anonymised. People set up accounts that they don't have to put their personal details in, and that is another area where the threat environment for us is, as law enforcement officers, we actively target.
And I might just add one thing just to round out from this context of the status of the criminal law. The criminal code does include specific offences that apply where a person engages in conduct to create, develop, control, moderate an electronic service, and does so intending that service would be used to commit online child abuse material offences, and that offence carries a term of imprisonment of 20 years, a maximum term of imprisonment of 20 years.
I should just add, Deputy Chair, I think another potential trend is live streaming, which is very difficult because it doesn't necessarily leave an electronic trace, apart from that data's been used. So that's not been hosted on something but been streamed live is another trend that we're seeing.
And just one more question from me. Child abuse material isn't something typically associated with organised crime, but is it the case that we're seeing any links there with organised crime in Australia and this sort of material?
If I can help you with that, Deputy Chair, certainly around the sextortion trend, our sense is that it is highly organised, that we are seeing individuals able to extort a number of victims in one point, and certainly the methodology and the typology there of the offender is certainly changing to a profit-generated methodology rather than the commodification of child abuse material. But certainly we're also seeing across the network of child abuse syndicates. Now, we say that they apply organised crime methodology, but they are highly organised in terms of their syndication, of the way that they share information, details about law enforcement obfuscation, and they create structures that would be akin to organised criminal syndicates. But again, their commodity is child abuse material.
We've had the benefit recently, end of last year, of actually a proceeds of crime activity, a civil case against an Adelaide person who, and so money was seized off that individual. So they're showing that activity was done for profit.
Was that a significant amount of money?
$165,000.
That's all from me.
Louise?
Look, I'm really interested in the concept of offender prevention, early intervention, and that the book and the package that you're putting together or have put together for the community at large and also through the schools. Is there an international body of evidence that actually shows that at a community base or a public, you can actually make a difference in that area? And presumably that's largely around helping victims not become victims, or potential victims not become victims, rather than necessarily stopping people becoming offenders, or is it a bit of both?
If it helps, I'll certainly start off through the ACE and the prevention initiatives that we do, and then I'll hand over to colleagues for a little bit more in depth if it assists the committee. So the pillar of prevention was a really strong and resounding requirement through the development of the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, or the ACE. And part of that was making sure that we do have a strong research base, that we do collaborate with not only our government agencies such as the Safety Commissioner, the National Office of Child Safety, but also non-government organisations who are key to driving some of these initiatives and strategies. You mentioned the book, Jack Changes the Game. So that was a critical sort of gap in the research and the prevention market that we identified with our stakeholders, and it was to give online grooming safety information for children aged between 5 and 8, and based around a real-life report that we received into the ACE about an individual that was on a gaming platform and encouraged to move to a private messaging area where they were then asked for intimate images of themselves. So we take that information, we cross-reference that with a reference group who have the skills and understanding of what the research tells us, and we benchmark the theory around the initiative against that. And a lot of our initiatives are done in that similar way. We cross-collaborate and make sure that it's backed up by research. In terms of this globally, certainly we collaborate through numerous law enforcement and global partners, most notably the Virtual Global Task Force, which is an alliance of 15 law enforcement partners, and also have affiliates through different NGOs around the world. And all those kind of prevention strategies, initiatives are all benchmarked against that. What we've identified is that due to online exploitation being such a global problem, and whatever seems to trend here in Australia could possibly trend in another country. And certainly the sextortion trend is seen equally as in the US and other countries as here. So we make sure that we are able to reach and penetrate the maximum amount of community members around the world with our prevention programs. And I'm happy to hand over in terms of offender prevention. Thank you.
Thank you. I can probably assist you somewhat. I think it's useful to start with the premise of the National Strategy to Prevent and Respond to Child Sexual Abuse being that child sexual abuse is preventable. I think sometimes in the face of the stats we can lose sight of the fact that it is based on that premise. So the National Strategy aims, I think, to shift the conversation or to shift work of governments away from strictly tertiary end, so what might be considered a law enforcement response once a crime has taken place, and move it towards primary prevention and secondary intervention. The two particular programs that I would bring to your attention under the strategy which go towards offending, one is a measure to set up a national prevention service for people who have thoughts and concerns about their own behaviour towards children but perhaps haven't yet offended. So the Royal Commission made a recommendation that Australia set up a service similar to a UK model called Stop It Now, which is an anonymised help-seeking service where you're able to ring up, discuss what might be concerning you about your behaviour, or you're able to ring up and discuss what may be concerning you about somebody else's behaviour, and get some advice about where you might be able to seek help for those thoughts and feelings. So really moving that towards early intervention or prevention. The second one is...
Before you move off that,
yes.
if you don't mind, can you give us some evidence about the use of that service? Even if you've got to take it on notice, we'd just like to have a brief on the service, how successful it's been, whether or not it needs to be modified.
I can. I'll point out that the service that we're setting up in Australia is yet to be established. So we're going through a period at the moment of working out what is international best practice, including the Stop It Now model, and then how does that translate into the Australian context and what would work best for us, and doing that in really close partnership with the states and territories and with police and colleagues. But we can certainly look to provide you with, I suspect, some evidence around why we think, or why the Royal Commission found some of these models might work.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Sorry, keep going.
Yes, of course.
We interrupted you midstream.
Not at all. So the second is a post-custodial program. So looking to work with individuals who have been convicted of a child sexual abuse offence and work with them to, I suppose, promote accountability and to prevent reoffending. So looking more towards a reintegration into the community model. And again, that work is in the early stages. Again, looking at international best practice and what might work in our context, and then looking to roll out a pilot in the coming year.
So I'm aware of a post-custodial program that I don't know how it works, but that is in existence in Adelaide in a mental health context. Do they exist elsewhere, and does that link into what you're proposing? Or
I think there's very limited offerings for post-custodial intervention in Australia, and I think we've commissioned an expert researcher who has a lot of significant background in this area to look at what is happening in Australia, so do a stock take of what's happening and how it's working, and then to also go globally and look at what is working globally.
So you haven't got that data as yet?
No, she's mid-consultation.
Yep, fair enough. Thank you. I'll leave that there for the moment.
Can I just follow on from there, if I can, in relation to previous evidence that's been given to us today and obviously through other submissions, is that the issue that relates to child abuse and the perpetrator, that they have a mental health issue, and that we should be looking at this from a health point of view as well as obviously law enforcement. So what you're trialling and the investigations you're doing now, is that part of the reason that the department's looking at that avenue? And do you think that is a serious aspect that we need to be able to deal with this? Because just locking people up doesn't stop the
I didn't
abuse.
get that. Could you try again?
Sorry.
Liz, Siri would like to answer. I'm reluctant because I'm not, an academic or someone who has sort of the data in front of me, but I think anecdotally what I would suggest is that, and certainly what the Royal Commission found, is that yes, an approach which only looks at a policing response is never going to be sufficient. We need to do something to sort of move it away from just leaving it until the crime has taken place, and that's where we're trying to sort of shift the dial, I suppose.
The AFP have any comments?
I think where we see our role is through the AFP, but the ACE as well, is that education and awareness piece, and that Jack Changes the Game is part of that. We identified a gap. We didn't think there was any education material for 5 to 8 year olds, and also the figure I mentioned before is a lot of parents won't speak to their children about online safety. But that's just one of the programs that the ACE are doing, really about raising that awareness, making it comfortable for people to talk about. So I think we see that as part of our prevention role in relation to this.
Louise, you have another question.
I did have one more question. So going back from the health to the public health sort of aspect, so back to the book, is there an online or an app or a game sort of part of that, something you can insert in? Because, speaking from my experience, my own children who are adults now, once they were onto the online version, they weren't terribly into the book version of anything. So is there some way that you can get this material actually in front of those kids at that point when they're most potentially engaged and also at risk?
Yeah, so this book has been available online. I think it was over 8,000 downloads. Or
8,000 copies disseminated to school. It's available for free online, and associated with it is toolkits, either for schools or for parents or carers, and it's linked through our 2 pillar websites, so the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation website and also our Think You Know website. And it's a complementary resource that goes with our significant resources for online child sexual safety with our Think You Know program.
Okay, but did they insert themselves into any of, or do you advertise through any of the sorts of games that kids are, and apps that kids are of that age are actually involved in? So we heard Roadblocks today,
so
new
you
one from me.
Do you put an ad into Roadblocks or something like that?
Yeah.
Or
no,
Spotify or things like that?
we haven't directly, no. I mean, we do use and leverage our different stakeholders that all cross-promote the work that we do, but there's certainly an opportunity that we can garner in terms of inserting prevention messaging within different sort of platforms and gaming. So there's certainly opportunity to do that.
Thank you.
We'll go to Senator Shoebridge for a few questions before we come back.
Thanks, Chair. In relation to the online book, I've just had a look at it. It's a kind of PDF. It's actually quite hard to navigate. You don't get the whole page up on the screen. Do you know if any kids have actually accessed it?
I don't have that data with me in terms of how many times we've had the PDF access, but certainly through the Think You Know portal, we have the, a little bit more intuitive connections with it. But the book's going to every single school, every primary school around the country. So that will be a resource in each school library coming out soon.
So one book to each school?
Correct.
Have you had any feedback from teachers about whether or not it's working?
Yeah, we've had some feedback through our stakeholder group to say that it really hits the mark, that children actually resonate with it. We did some trials with youth advisory groups through Brave Hearts about making sure that it's understood by children. They understood the intent of it and what comes out of it. It's a very brand new initiative, so there's still a lot of data to capture on it. We only launched it a month ago, so hopefully we will gain some more data to be able to tailor-make this resource for future audiences.
I suppose some...
I do have the figure, Senator, how much
Yep.
has been downloaded, if that
Yeah, that'd be
helps.
good.
Yeah, so it's since 4th of October, 3,687 times.
88. 88.
88.
Yep.
Sorry.
I've got to say, I think a static PDF is not going to engage kids. It's just, I can't imagine kids working their way through a static PDF like I just did.
Yep.
And I think probably the question was coming to you from across the other side there was, have you got something more engaging? Something that's actually going to engage kids on a kind of a journey rather than a static PDF. Do you have plans for that?
I think that's a good point. I think this is a first step, though, to really start that engagement between parents and children. Because we're talking about very young children here, and from the research that Commander Serek said before, we're finding parents aren't speaking to their children about online safety, and this is a vehicle that we believe that will assist that. But we take your point. It's certainly something that we need to get feedback on and improve as we move forward.
I think it was on the 1st of September, the draft codes were released by the industry, and the draft codes to protect Australians from harmful content. And I'm particularly talking about, I think it's phase 1, classes 1A and 1B material. Are you aware of the draft codes?
I think we're aware, but that it's a matter that's being led by the eSafety Commissioner rather than the Attorney General's Department.
Yeah, I know it's been led by the eSafety Commissioner, but I'm assuming your different organisations have at least a process in reviewing the draft codes and making the submissions on the draft codes.
I'm not aware that we performed that role, no.
The Attorney General's not doing it? No one in the Attorney General's department?
No, sorry, Senator. Yes, we saw a while back sort of some earlier versions that we provided some comments and feedback on.
I'm asking about the draft codes that were released for a formal consultation process by the industry, started 1 September, which may well form the backbone going forward about the Australian response to this. Has anybody from the Child Abuse and Family Violence section, Cyber and Cross-Border Data Policy Branch, or the International and Security Cooperation Division from the Attorney General's Department engage with those draft codes?
So I think what Mr Knott just said is that we had been consulted and provided some comments, but we may need to take on notice the dates.
I think Mr Knott said an earlier iteration, actually.
Drafts.
That's what I heard.
Sorry,
Drafts.
of the draft. So yes, the draft versions.
The ones that went out on the 1st of September 2022.
So I understand we saw drafts of what eventually became the versions that went out.
Drafts of the drafts?
Drafts of the drafts,
So
yes,
my
sorry.
question is quite simple. It's getting confusing.
Yes, it is.
Right.
Yes, I think
I'm
we...
asking, just to be clear,
Can I just
about the 1
remind you,
September.
Senator, can I, to help so that we all get the information we're seeking, if you can ask the question and then allow the witness to answer,
Sorry.
I think would be
Sorry, I think...
It helps if you address my question, which was about
I'm sorry,
the draft codes that went out on
Senator.
1 September.
Yes, and I guess apologies. I think we were thinking of the final version of the drafts that were released, and we have been consulted in their development. If you would like us to take on notice the details of that consultation, we can come back to you.
I'm asking if you're going to have a response to the industry's proposed regulatory scheme, draft code of conduct, that they released for public consultation on the 1st of September 2022. Is the Attorney General's Department, any part of the Attorney General's Department, going to put a submission in or respond to the draft codes that were put out for public consultation by the industry on the 1st of September 2022?
Understood, and I do not believe we yet have a position on whether we will make a submission to those. Sorry, I might just check with my colleague in the National Office for Child Safety as to whether there was anything further. No. So I think that's yet to be decided, Senator.
But this is the industry's proposal for how they're going to respond proactively to detect and remove some of the most harmful online content. This is the game at the moment. This is the game in town. And the Attorney General's Department doesn't even have a position about whether or not they're going to engage with that process. This is the main game in town at the moment.
I'm not sure we have anything further to add other than that if we make a submission, then we will make a submission.
You might make a submission?
Correct, Senator. Sorry,
I'm going to ask the same questions now of the AFP. This is the main game in town. This is the industry's main response for this stuff. They've put it out for submissions on the 1st of September. What's the AFP's position about engaging with that process?
My understanding, Senator, and I'll need to take some of it on notice, we did, through the Attorney General's Department on the previous version, provide some feedback through the department. I'm not aware of anything with the 1st of September, but I can take that on notice and come back to this committee.
Well, I mean, some of the people who are engaging and the organisations that are engaging with this process, such as the International Justice Mission, for example, have raised serious concerns about the lack of protections in the draft codes. For example, that the draft codes don't require the use of technological tools to detect child sexual abuse material. They've pointed that out as a major problem in the codes. Is that a concern for the AFP?
I'll need to take that on notice, Senator. I don't have the details in front of me.
Well, do you think the codes that are meant to be the main way in which the industry is regulating itself in this regard, and this is a question to both the AFP and the AG's department, do you think the codes should require providers of online platforms and services to use technological tools to detect child sexual abuse material?
I think you're asking for our opinion there, Senator. We wouldn't be able to provide that.
Yes,
Well,
I think Senator, I think it'd be helpful to acknowledge that both the AFP and the department have taken on notice, and it's not going to be helpful if you just rephrase your question when the question is still the same.
Well, does the AFP have any knowledge about whether or not technological tools are available to detect child sexual abuse material?
I can take that question, Senator. There's certainly various different tools out there that intend to be able to identify child abuse material on the internet. Those tools are well versed around the world. The Solace Downloader, Thorn do a tool in relation to that to be able to identify and detect. But by and large, tools such as that still require a human being to be able to identify child abuse material, particularly around the inability to sort of decipher what is legitimate sort of skin tones in terms of images versus other. In terms of the broader harmful content, I can't make a comment from the child exploitation side, but certainly there would be tools out there that companies are developing for this purpose.
Well, but the particular concern is if you've got end-to-end encryption, the service provider itself needs to have some kind of surveillance, some kind of response before it gets encrypted. Do you accept that that is an important potential control measure going forward?
We would submit that anything that companies can do to enhance the protection of children is absolutely a positive pathway.
That goes without saying,
Yeah.
Commander, but I'm asking you about specifically when you've got end-to-end encryption, what the International Justice Mission, for example, says, that providers of encrypted electronic services should be required to use technological tools and behavioural indicators to detect child sexual abuse material before it enters the encrypted space. That's what the International Justice Mission says. They've looked at the codes, it's not there in the codes. Do you think that would be an important measure?
We'll take that on notice, Senator. I do agree, though, that the end-to-end encryption does erode service providers' ability to detect and respond. So I do agree with that.
But we need a policy response to that. We need some kind of response to that other than it's a problem. Now, I suppose that's what I thought the AFP and the Attorney General's Department were here, to work out what the response is other than noting it's a problem. The International Justice Mission have a response. They've got a suggestion, seems sensible. And I'm asking you about it. Do you agree?
I think also...
Sorry, we do need to note that policy responsibility for end-to-end encryption actually sits with the Department of Home Affairs, not with the Attorney General's Department.
Just remind the committee in relation to questions of policy, those people before us as witnesses are not able to express their opinion on policy. They can give you the facts of what the department has done or is doing.
Does the AFP use any or have access to any technological tools to detect child sexual abuse material? Some kind of artificial intelligence attached to screening software? Do you do that?
No, we don't necessarily perform tools to go out there and screen the internet, for instance, but we do have tools that, through the development of the Australian Victim Identification Database, where seizures of child abuse material are coming in. We hold that database and we categorise those images, and we use a software tool on top of that to be able to quickly decipher what is child abuse material and what isn't, so that we minimise the need for investigators to continually categorise material that is seized again and again.
Do you know of any online platforms or services that do this effectively?
That screen the internet, is that, sorry?
That use technological tools to detect child sexual abuse material?
Well, I can certainly say from the volume of reports that come into the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, the cyber tip line, they received 29.4 million reports globally in last year in relation to companies reporting about child abuse material. How they detect that is each individual's company's aspects, but they do report in a significant number.
Well, I suppose I'm asking if you know what the best-in-class measures are that have been adopted by online platforms and services. Can you point to one which has got a best-in-class model?
I can't directly right now. I'd have to take that one notice.
One more question at this point in time, Senator Shoebridge, before I move on.
I don't know if it's been very productive, this line. So I suppose I have one question to the AFP, particularly about your staff. What measures you've got in place to protect the mental health and the welfare of staff who are, doing this extraordinarily important work. And I know from my experience with state police, it can be unrelenting, it can be brutal, and it can be very psychologically damaging. What are the measures you have in place to protect your staff who do this work?
Thank you for the question, Senator. And it's certainly our number one priority in this space is our welfare of our people. So I suppose there's a couple of measures in place, and then I might pass on to Commander Serek for a little bit more detail. But the actual building where a lot of our people work has actually been it's intricately designed as a wellbeing plan in itself, with separate areas for people, wellbeing areas outside of the actual work area that they work. It's set up in a way that it protects people actually visiting the building, so they're not exposed to the areas where the child exploitation material is being viewed, even down to details like Friday, wellbeing dogs are let into the building. People can bring in their own dogs, and we find that very beneficial for our members as well. The AFP more broadly, though, of course, has psychologists that deal with our members continuously, and our SHIELD program, which is bringing a lot of that welfare service to the front line, and that sits over the top. All our members need to be psychologically cleared before they can view this material and conduct this work, but they're also subject to then every 6 months they are subject to that to be renewed, or on a needs basis of when, depending on type of work. But the ACE actually has an actual mental health plan as well that sits over the top, and I might pass to Commander Serek, who will provide a bit more detail.
Thank you. As the Assistant Commissioner said, we have our own health and wellbeing plan. It's been predicated around best practice. It's had a lot of involvement from psychologists and the members' input as well. It's an area in the AFP that isn't opt-in. No one ever gets forced to work within child exploitation. members opt in to stay there. As soon as they want to do something else, there's no questions asked. We facilitate that move for them. We have a culture that is really predicated around people able to discuss what they've seen and how they feel, which is why, as the Assistant Commissioner said, we have dedicated floors on the ACE to make sure that people are free to discuss whatever it is they need to discuss with their colleagues going forward. We have an in-house psychologist who's dedicated to the ACE and our members, and that's an open door policy. They can go and engage with them at any one time. We have that continuous renewal about psych and health and wellbeing for these members, and we continually benchmark ourselves around not only in Australia but also globally. I'm proud to say that our ACE mental health plan has been asked by countries around the world, not least of which the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and Interpol have asked to see in our health and wellbeing plan, because it is considered by their perspective as a real pillar of strength for the way that our members operate and stay well within working in this difficult crime type.
And are you tracking, have you got data tracking how it's working in practice, the number of claims that have been made? Are you tracking that data?
Yep. Yeah, we're tracking the data, and the information tells us that we rarely have people opting out because of the exposure to the material. People opt out for other areas, other reasons, such as needing to move or career development or wanting to do a different role. The actual viewing of child abuse material and the work within there isn't usually the primary reason why people go out. And we do have data that we can send through about how many, for instance, Comcare claims are attributed to the work in this crime type.
If you could track that from before and then following the introduction of that would be really helpful.
Sure, we can take that on notice. Thank you, Senator.
Some time, Senator Dan.
Thank you, Chair. And firstly, I take my hat off to you guys. Like, you guys do amazing work in this field, and you do the best you can with the tools you have. And I take my hat off to you all. It's a tough gig, and thank you very much for doing it. We really appreciate it. I've got 2 daughters, and I would hate for anything to happen to my daughters in this field. So thank you for everything that you all do. And with that, so we've seen not a huge increase, but we've seen a big increase over the last 3 years in this field of what's happening since COVID. Where do we see this in, say, the 10-year, like what's our 10-year plan? Do we have a 10-year plan towards this? And how are we getting there to work towards that plan to try and eliminate it over time?
If it assists, I'll ask, and thank you for the question. So, yes, we absolutely have a plan. We have the ACE strategic plan, which is the next iteration from the ACE blueprint. The ACE has been operating now for 4 years, and now we've developed with our stakeholders a strategic plan that goes to 2026. Obviously, our mission is to make sure that all children are free from exploitation. That's our constant goal that we're working towards. The strategic plan, though, we create for a 4-year period to make sure that we are able to adapt and be agile to the changes of different sort of technologies coming forward. As you can probably appreciate, there's always something new coming out, so we want to make sure that our plan and our strategies are agile in relation to that. We have some really clear structures and objectives about what we want to achieve to prevent, pursue, protect and promote the awareness around child exploitation. I do see that the prevalence of child exploitation and the trend that it's going is ultimately increasing, and that's particularly around the reliance that we have and the internet, and the connectivity gives us some great tools to be able to connect across the world. During COVID, it was critical, and it's the way that our children were able to continue to go to school and us to visit, parents and carers, but that also opens up the vulnerability of offenders to be able to exploit. I think our aim is to change the tune, giving victims and potential victims the voice to be able to identify what's not right for them, that they've got avenues of reporting, that it's not obscure about who they need to tell, to make sure that they're not in fear or that they think that they're going to get in trouble. What we've identified is that a lot of victims and families are worried about the stigma attached to something like when a photo of themselves has been generated online. So our efforts really need to be there to close back the opportunities for offenders to exploit.
Yep. And, yep.
I was going to supplement the Commander's response with the broader 10-year strategic framework which the Australian Government is working towards with our state and territory government colleagues is the National Strategy to Prevent and Respond to Child Sexual Abuse, which was launched on 27 October last year and takes us through to 2030. It is based on that public health model, so it's equally focused on primary prevention, early intervention, and then the tertiary response. I think Commander Sirik also mentioned the prevalence in terms of talking about trends. I think just draw your attention to one of the areas that the Royal Commission highlighted, and I think is widely accepted, is that we, up until shortly, have had less robust prevalence data in terms of broadly understanding all forms of child sexual abuse in Australia. So the national strategy goes beyond online. It looks at also familial abuse and institutional abuse. The Australian Child Maltreatment Study, which will be published in March of next year, will be the first time we'll have a really robust data set that will tell us about the prevalence of child sexual abuse in the Australian community.
Okay, yep, thank you. And so with the 4-year plan, so to 2026, what are the barriers that are restricting you all from doing your roles correctly to be able to do the best you can? What is holding you back at all? What things can we do better as such from a federal government point of view? What are things that we can do to make it better for you guys and easier for your jobs to be able to be as efficient and effective as possible?
I mean, we work pretty very well, I think, within the existing legislation, the way it stands. Of course, technology is going to be a massive hurdle for us. The Senator spoke about the end-to-end encryption, which makes it difficult for industry to identify what's going on. I think this is why we put so much emphasis on that education and awareness, that prevention part, to get in front of the game, to talk about it, as Commander Sirik highlighted, as well as part of that 4-year plan, is very much around we don't want to wait for the crime to be committed. We want to prevent it up front, get people talking about it, awareness. And we've talked about really just one. The children's book is just one of the things that the ACE is doing at the moment in relation to that. I should say, coming out of COVID, we've certainly seen an increase in online referrals, but something that we've certainly got our mind on is now people travelling overseas again, and in regard to contact offending overseas. And so there's we're working about raising awareness in relation to that, and that's a pilot project that will come out in the next month in respect to that. So we're always looking for that next trend, whether it be the sextortion, that travelling, and work about raising that awareness so we can get people coming forward.
I have a couple of questions, and then I'll go to Louise again. Project Karma, in their submission, said that there's not a willingness on the part of the AFP to sign a memorandum of understanding with them. What are the issues? I understand, as they explained, that there's some issues around people's privacy, but when we're talking about such abhorrent crimes, protecting the privacy of a perpetrator as opposed to protecting our children, it's a bit hard to understand why these barriers are still there. Acting Assistant Commissioner, can you explain to us why there is no memorandum of understanding?
I might pass on to the Commander specifically about that specific MOU, if I may.
Yeah, so what I'm aware about Project Karma is that the engagement, certainly within our offshore posts, have been critical, and I understand that Project Karma works really closely with some of our offshore partners. In terms of a memorandum of understanding, I mean that is Yeah, I'm unaware of their comments in relation to the issues that they've presented, but certainly we engage with a whole host of variety of stakeholders, at least through the ACE and the AFP, and we'll continue to look at for those opportunities. But I'm not certain of what their specific
Well, we will
barriers they've
invite
cited.
you to have a look at the evidence that was given and their submission,
Yep.
and to give us a response to the committee on notice if
Sure.
you're happy to do that. The other issue is sitting here and listening to the evidence both from the department and from the AFP. There seems to be the view that everything is being done that can be done, and that the collaboration between states and territories and different elements of law enforcement are all working very collaboratively together. It's not really been my experience that is actually the case on my former time on this committee. Is there not more work to be done in terms of sharing of information between states and the federal department? And, you know, I asked earlier witnesses and they said that these sort of questions were better directed at the AFP and the Attorney General's department. So I would like your views for the committee, if you can enlighten us as to where you see these issues.
So I think in terms of the criminal law framework, we think that the Commonwealth's legislative arrangements for online child abuse material are very strong and complement the contact offences that sit within the responsibilities of the states and territories. As I said, we are reviewing the offences and we will be working with the states and territories in that context to ensure there are no legislative gaps in terms of the conduct that is criminalised. But in terms of operational cooperation and information sharing, I'll defer to the AFP on that one.
Before we just go to the AFP on that issue, what you're giving as your evidence is you do not see any issues at this point in time. I understand you're doing an audit, that there's any difference by states and territories in terms of their legislation around their penalties for these sorts of crimes.
So there's a complementary state and territory legislation that goes along with the Commonwealth's framework. The important thing to note is the states and territories can investigate Commonwealth offences. They are available to all of the law enforcement agencies within Australia if they encounter online child sexual offending. As to the state and territory offences that they might have within their individual jurisdictions, I'm not aware of how the conduct that's criminalised and the penalties line up. But when we're talking about the online child sexual abuse space, we know the Commonwealth offences are there and are able to be used consistently across Australia wherever that conduct may arise.
Okay, thank you.
From an operational perspective, Chair, we work very closely with our state and territory counterparts. So the AFP looks at predominantly the criminal misuse of the telecommunications services and also for people that travel overseas. But we realise that we come across a lot of state offending as well. So in most capital cities, there's now been what we call the jacket being stood up, which is the joint anti-child exploitation teams. So they're joint teams with AFP and state and territory police, and where there's seamless exchange of information and where the appropriate legislation will be applied, whether it be Commonwealth or state offences, state or territory offences, to the criminality that we're seeing. So it's seamless from an operational perspective in the capital city, in the jurisdictions.
And I could
Commander, you look like you want to make a contribution.
Well, I'll just add to that as well. In the ACE, we also have other government agencies that are embedded in there into our intelligence fusion cell. So we have Home Affairs, we have AUSTRAC, ACIC, and ABF, and those agencies at the government level all share information and intelligence. We create joint products, intelligence products. So that seamless information exchange happens within the ACE, both at that intelligence level and also at the operational level, as we see through the operational teams around the country.
Yes, I was going to ask you about AUSTRAC, because my understanding is, because now there seems to be more financial gain as part of this exploitation, that they're pretty involved. And I was just wondering, for the benefit of other committee meetings members, if you could give us an overview of how the AFP and and AUSTRAC actually work together in this area?
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, AUSTRAC are embedded into the Intelligence Fusion Cell in the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. They have unique powers and access to banking information and suspicious monetary reports. That information, as appropriately, is shared with the AFP, and we're able to then identify through also our collaboration with Home Affairs those individuals that might be sending suspicious financial remittances offshore, and with our intelligence holdings be able to develop insights into whether we believe that that relates to any host of offending, namely such as live streaming, or even people paying for access to sites that are potentially hosting child abuse material. So that information happens immediately with our partners within the ACE, and there appears to be no barriers in that sort of information exchange for the appropriate dissemination of that information between us.
Might just add one more thing on your information sharing question.
Yes, I think, Senator, if I might, just more broadly than the sort of law enforcement and criminal offence information sharing, under the national strategy, we are also working with other jurisdictions to develop a national child safety and wellbeing information sharing scheme, and that goes more towards sort of broader child safety concerns rather than specific online criminal information sharing.
Louise is just, unfortunately, Mr. Lim, who would have liked to have been here but is unwell now, so he's put forward some questions. Some we'll put on notice, but we're just going to ask one now so he knows that we haven't forgotten about him.
And he's online, so he can hear us.
He can hear us, can he?
So thank you. So Mr. Lim has directed this largely at you, Commander Siric, but I think we'll open it up to anyone. So he refers to an organisation called MindGeek, which holds, I'll just read it, which holds a lion's share of the online pornography market, has been in the news for hosting child sexual abuse material on its platform. In a letter to Canada's House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information Privacy and Ethics, sexual abuse survivors were signatories to the statement that MindGeek systematically failed to moderate, review or report such material on its platform. Mr. Lim says, I do not believe we can trust an industry to self-regulate, and he wants to know, are the penalties sufficient for technology companies, whether it's Google or Meta, or do these companies only cooperate to the minimum extent necessary to avoid penalty? And I guess if you have any particular comment on that platform as well, that would be interesting.
In terms of, and thank you for the question, Mr. Lim, in terms of the MindGeek platform, no, I don't have any data in relation to that. Our understanding of different platforms would certainly be around whether we see Australian IP addresses that are linked to any reports and offending. But in terms of penalties, it's not something for the AFP to comment on in relation to the appropriateness of that.
One question more before I go to Senator Shoebridge, and that refers to the 21-22 AFP annual report and Operations Malto. I was wondering if you can give us any evidence about the lessons learnt. I mean, obviously, you're not going to give us all the information that we perhaps would like, but in terms of the Act, how that has assisted, whether you've learnt from lessons from that investigation, because my understanding there was 158 search warrants in Australia. There was 121 men with 1,248 charges, and removed 5 children from harm. So was there lessons learnt? Are there things that you've learnt that worked really well, or were there issues that we need to improve on, and lessons obviously that will make operations more effective in the future?
Yeah, I think an Operation Malta does highlight that sort of national coordination effort that's really critical in being able to provide the right resources across the country to deal with that. So whilst the ACE was developed as a 4-year policy proposal, it really solidified the need for that national coordination piece that we can offer through the ACE. So that was really great for us to work with our state and territory agencies. So it complemented complements the already national architecture of coordination through Operation Griffin that sets up sort of that collaborative piece across the country. What was also critical is that engagement with our offshore partners, so with New Zealand, noting that they also had a complementary investigation in relation to that. And we also highlighted that the New Zealand Operation H also related to matters in the UK as well. So it really highlighted that international collaboration, cooperation that needs to continually occur on these matters. And I think it really was an excellent sort of example of a company working with law enforcement, highlighting that this is on a file sharing platform and the need for us to activate quickly.
Thank you. Senator Shoebridge.
Thanks, Chair. I suppose for the AFP, critical to being effective in this space is your partnerships with foreign law enforcement. Is that right? Yep. Could I ask you in terms of, and one of the jurisdictions that's most visible in terms of providing, well, in terms of having a significant number of noxious online participants is Russia. Would you agree?
I don't have those figures in front of me, Senator, but I don't disagree.
All right. Well, I'll take don't disagree. What are the institutional arrangements you have with Russia in order to pursue your goals of bringing to account people who are offending in Australia?
Most of our work in this space specifically in regard to overseas is Southeast Asia. So we have a very good relationship with the countries in Southeast Asia. From a Russian perspective in crime more generally, we do speak on a law enforcement to law enforcement basis. And we have a liaison officer based in Belgrade that is responsible on a law enforcement basis where criminality is identified. But most of our work, sorry, Senator, cutting off.
I thought you finished.
Most of our work, as I said before, is in Southeast Asia. We have a centre that we provide significant support in the Philippines in relation to this, which we call the Philippine Internet Crimes Against Children Centre. It's not only ourselves, but also the UK National Crime Agency are involved. And that's rescued over 556 victims since February 2019. So that's where most of our work comes from in relation to this.
But in relation to Russia, my geography is not great, but Belgrade's not in Russia.
That's correct.
So there's nobody in Russia?
We don't have a liaison post in Russia, that's correct.
And there's no extradition treaty with Russia?
International crime cooperation is a matter for the Attorney General's Department. I apologise, I don't know off the top of my head what our extradition arrangements are with Russia.
Well, it's my understanding there isn't one, and given the nature of their criminal justice system, we probably wouldn't have one.
I'm not going to disagree with you, I just don't have that.
Yep, I'll take not disagree again, that's fine. So I'm just wondering on a practical level, if somebody is offending in Russia, as an example, against Australian laws in relation to child sexual abuse material, what can the AFP do? Apart from talk to someone in Belgrade.
I might just start by saying that the Australian offences do require a link to Australia. They require an offender who's here. They require the use of a carriage service that's here. So there is that requirement for a link to Australia. Just important to note.
Understand that.
I should just say, Senator, that the AFP has relationships with law enforcement agencies around the world, but not necessarily have liaison officers in those specific countries. So our office in Belgrade is not responsible just for Serbia, but for countries in that area. Similar to the UK, has got responsibilities outside of just the UK as well as another country. So the fact that we don't have individuals there doesn't mean we don't. There's no relationship that exists with Russian law enforcement. We of course work within. I suppose, a process of sharing information, but of course we don't share information if there's a death penalty, death penalty offences that we're investigating. But in this specific case, if there was an Australian link to some offending over in Russia, I'm not sure what the crime would be over there. We would have to be very careful in regard to sharing information, so I'll take that on notice, and all my colleagues, if there is a death penalty involved.
To some extent, it's just not possible to comment on a hypothetical crime that might be committed from Russia.
I'm
involving
interested in what
Australian offences.
the institutional links are with law enforcement in Russia that enables you to do your job. And so far, Acting Assistant Commissioner, I've heard there's somebody in Belgrade, but nothing else. I'm not aware of what other institutional links there are.
I'll have to take a specific notice what specific relationship we'd have, but our senior officer in Belgrade is part of that responsibility of that post there includes Russia.
And are there no other? Is that the only AFP officer positioned outside of Australia responsible for liaison with Russia, or is it the only one in relation to child sexual abuse material?
No. Can you ask that question again? I didn't quite understand.
Well, are there other AFP officers positioned in Russia who deal with matters other than child sexual abuse material? Or is the Belgrade office the one that deals with all of the AFP concerns with
There's
Russia?
no AFP officers in Russia, and Belgrade's responsible for law enforcement, liaison, for want of a better word, with Russia.
Okay, thanks.
Any further questions? No further questions. Have you got any more? No? Oh, we've done very well then. Can I thank you all very much for what you do, but I'd just also like to put on the record on behalf of the committee some of those comments that Senator Shoebridge made. I mean, we share here in terms of the work that's done on behalf of all children around the world of the AFP and also the legislation agendas from the Attorney General's office. This is an increasing crime, unfortunately, but I'm hoping that with the recent hacking that has occurred into two significant organisations in this country will make all householders more aware of the need to monitor what's happening on their computers in their lounge rooms, and unfortunately those who have children who have them in their bedrooms, that this is a wake-up call for not only parents around this country and carers, but also for governments, that we have to do more, we have to be smarter, and we have to have more people working in this area. So thank you very much for your evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we will move on to the Australian Institute of Criminology, call our witnesses. You will? You'll pass. Thank you very much. I will now do my official welcome. Dr. Brown, Deputy Director at the Australian Institute of Criminology, thank you for appearing before us. The Senate has resolved that an officer of the Department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of an officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution does not preclude questions being asked or explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. I understand that the information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to the Senate committee has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today, and then I will invite you to make a short opening statement, and at the conclusion of your remarks we will go to questions from the committee. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Rick Brown. I'm Deputy Director with the Australian Institute of Criminology. I have no opening statement.
Thank you for that, and we will first go to Ms Miller Forrest, who is going to start off with Mr Kim's questions, I understand.
So the member for Tangi, Sam Lim's online, so I have a question from him. I'll just read it. So it says, Dr Brown, thank you for your submission. On page 4 you list the traits or cluster profiles contrasting CSAM online, so only offenders and contact offenders. One of the attributes given to the online offender is having problems with sexual preoccupations and sexual self-regulation. He says, I wanted to take the opportunity to get your thoughts on the accessibility to violent and disturbing pornography already available online and how this may feed into these problems. Knowing that CCM has been found also on these sites, do you believe anything needs to be done to curb the accessibility of what is violent pornography, and do you think that an age and identity verification would be useful?
So thank you for the question. So there's actually quite a body of research that shows the escalation from adult pornography into child sexual abuse material, and there's a clear overlap in terms of both the location of those material, often found on the same platforms, and as well as an escalation in sexual deviance, from more severe forms of adult pornography moving then into child sexual abuse material as consumers look for more severe content, essentially. So certainly that there is a relationship between the two. I should say that we are actually in the process of undertaking some further research to look at the links between adult pornography and sexual aggression, and we're about to go out to tender for a supplier to undertake a survey of the Australian public to explore some of those attitudes and experiences of accessing extreme material as well. Age verification is I think an interesting issue from a number of perspectives. I mean, obviously, one is the one that's being pursued, as I understand, around adult pornography and blocking access to those that to underage to minors. But there's the flip side as well, which is age verification for users of services that are aimed for adults and with children using those as well. So I think age verification plays a number of roles in dealing with this particular issue.
We heard from someone earlier, I can't remember who, about that paedophilia is a recognised mental health condition. It's listed in the DSM-5. The idea that somebody might move from violent adult porn into child sex abuse material, do you have any comment on how that fits with a distinct mental health condition, or should I be asking a psychiatrist? So.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, someone better qualified than I am. But for what it's worth, my view would be that not all child consumers of child sexual abuse material, which is what we're talking about here, would be classed as paedophiles. In fact, and probably they sit in the minority, and with, as we were talking earlier, that escalation in kind of interest in sexualised material means that you have a cohort of individuals that are looking for any kind of sexual content, which includes children. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're paedophiles. In fact, I'd go so far to say that the increase that we've seen in child sexual abuse material isn't actually a function of increase in paedophilia as such. If you think, if you say National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children, you've heard the figures earlier in the hearing that last year they received 29 million reports. Well, if you go back to 1998, that was just 9,700 reports. So that's a 3,000-fold increase over that period. Now, I don't think anyone would suggest there's been a 3,000-fold increase in the number of paedophiles. It's actually about opportunity and availability of this material, which means that people are accessing it more regularly.
I think we're also online more than we were in those days.
Absolutely.
Look, I find that concept that we are getting a whole load of people who are are accessing the child sexual abuse material in the context of it being a more extreme form of pornography as opposed to specifically child sexual abuse material. Do you have any thoughts about how that affects, I'm thinking, for instance, we've heard about post-offender programs, but also prevention programs. If we've now got this broader range of motivations about why and how people are getting involved in this and accessing it, how does that actually affect the sorts of programs we should be running? Leaving aside, obviously, protection of children as a specific program, but in terms of focusing on those perpetrators and potential perpetrators.
So we heard a comment of Stop It Now earlier as in a sense, one important early intervention for individuals that are starting down that line of accessing child sexual abuse material, and I think that's an important first step. So any off ramps that can be created to divert individuals from accessing that kind of material has got to be a good thing. But that obviously needs to be then, as individuals become more kind of entrenched in accessing that kind of material, that's when other forms of treatment are going to be more important for dealing with child sex offenders. There we generally have limited options. So the state of treatment options for child sexual abuse material offenders is less developed than it is for child sexual abuse offenders. So we know more about contact offending and what works than we do about what particularly works for CSAM offenders. So in terms of child sexual abuse contact perpetrators, we know that forms of cognitive behavioural therapy, in particular, especially supported by peer support through programs like Circles of Support and Accountability, seem to work particularly in the community. Options for treatment are less effective for contact offenders in prison, and individual treatments work better than group treatments. That's kind of what we know about that group. In terms of CSAM offenders, particularly CSAM consumers, we're really in the early stages of developing treatment programs. In fact, one of those programs has been developed by funding through the Australian Institute of Criminology, working with Swinburne University, and they've developed a program, and that's currently being tested in a group work setting. So hopefully in time we'll have Australian-based programs that can actually deal with the growth in CSAM offenders.
Okay. I'm trying not to pose this as a leading question, but I think it's going to be a leading question anyway. Is that, do you think, because of their their lack of identity as self-identity as an abuser? Are they not seeing that the harm is there, even if they're not physically doing the harm themselves? Is that the issue, that they don't identify, or they don't recognise themselves in that category of offender?
I suspect for some that there will be that. I mean, in criminology, we could call that technique of neutralisation, which offenders will apply to their own offending to if you like, deny that it's an issue with offending. But there are also, I guess, other reasons that make this a difficult crime from a treatment perspective, in that actually showing impact is tricky, because we're often looking at long-term periods of time before reoffending occurs, and most don't reappear in the criminal justice system. So it's actually quite difficult to then prove beyond simply whether there's a change in attitudes and self-reported behaviour, whether in fact those kinds of programs are effective. It takes quite a long time before we actually know whether they're effective or not.
Okay, thank you.
Just to follow on from that question, the fact that there's treatments for those who act out child sexual abuse or pedophilia, the fact that has been known and been recognised in the community over decades, as opposed to what's happening now online, is that also part of the reason where it's hard to identify the sort of treatment for those abusers who are online, as opposed to those that we have recognised and law enforcement has acted upon, those in-person actions?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Chair, that this is there's a difference in timescale for this. This is as a form of behaviour. So obviously with contact child sex abuse has probably been around forever as an issue, whereas we're talking really 30 years for this is a problem in the online space. There's an awful lot of work still to be done to work out what works for CSAM consumers. What we do know, though, is that child sex contact offenders, when CSAM offenders participate in programs designed for contact offenders, the outcomes aren't very good for the CSAM offenders. So it's not a case of just applying the same kind of treatment. You actually need a different kind of program to deal with. And as we outlined at the outset, there are these different profiles for CSAM offenders compared to contact offenders, and it's that you need to really hone in on and focus on to develop treatments.
So in terms of, you have online offenders of child abuse, you have the in-person personal abuse on the individual child, and then now what seems to be emerging is, which makes it much harder to detect, is live streaming. Is that a different characteristic of an offender to the other two examples?
It is, Chair, in a number of ways. The very nature of the offending is different. It's because it combines both contact and consuming in a way that you'd think of other forms of child sexual abuse material being pre-recorded, pre-photographed, and you're viewing that material that's historic by definition. Live streaming, by definition, is contemporary and but also guided by a consumer. So in that sense, it combines both contact offending by a third party that's at the other end of the live streaming, as well as the consumer who's conducting that. What's interesting, so we, I think in 2020, we published some work on live streaming of child sex abuse, looking at the consumers from Australia. We and this was based on an operation in the Philippines that identified a number of facilitators in the Philippines, and then through the AFP we were able to obtain information about the individuals that were sending money to those facilitators, and working with Austrac, we identified the financial transactions that were going to those individuals. And that operation identified 256 Australians that were purchasing live streaming of child sex abuse in the Philippines just through that one operation. 2,700 transactions over 13 years by those individuals. The nature of the Austrac data and financial data means that there isn't a huge amount of demographic detail in those transactions, but we did have the age of those involved. And what's interesting is the age profile is quite different to both child sexual abuse contact offenders and the typical CSAM offender, in that they were much older. So we found that 2/3 of that sample were in fact aged in between 50 and 69, whereas typically a CSAM consumer would be in the range 35 to 45. So they're an older cohort that are involved in that kind of offending. I'll just finish by saying what's interesting about that particular piece of work is that we could demonstrate how escalation occurred over time. So we found that the frequency of transactions increased over time, so the duration between transactions declined the more transactions that were made, and also the amount that individuals were willing to pay for that abuse increased over time, which suggested that individuals were perhaps asking for more severe material over time, and another aspect of the escalation, and therefore paying more for it. So it's a particularly problematic form of child sexual abuse.
There's also the other issue when we're looking at some overseas countries, so the poorer countries, that in fact there is evidence that some families will sell their child to gain money for the family, that they willingly sell their child for a week to somebody who's coming into the country for a week, has that child, and then they return to the family, but in return for that they get money that obviously helps the family survive. So, if families don't realise what they're doing is abuse to their child, then it's going to be extremely hard to stop, will it not?
Absolutely. It's, there are huge social issues in those countries that essentially Australian men are, exploiting in a sense. That abuse comes in different ways. Some is organised through sex dens in those countries, but increasingly, because of the ease with which the technologies are available, essentially the ease with which people living in poverty can make some money, it's becoming more of a locally produced form of crime within the family. So absolutely. So families are, and that can be a parent, it can be an uncle or auntie, or indeed a sister, older sister that's actually involved in perpetrating. One of the things we found actually looking at this was that often it is a female family member that's the facilitator who engages with the consumer in a country like Australia, and making that connection, followed by the abuse then being arranged.
Senator Shoebridge, you have some questions?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. And Dr. Brown, thanks for your 2 submissions, which are extremely thorough and have the most thorough set of sort of research behind them of submissions that I've seen. And I just want to indicate whoever in your office did them, they're extremely, I regard them very highly, and I'm sure the committee does too, very high quality. Could I ask you about the role of tech companies? And you deal with this more in your second submission. And it's really about the issue of end-to-end encryption. You indicate that the increased adoption of end-to-end encryption will probably increase challenges in detecting online sexual exploitation of children. And then you're not the only submission that makes the point. you make the point that while many large tech companies, and you give the example of Meta, are moving towards the use of end-to-end encryption, most have not publicly announced if or how they will detect, prevent and remove child sexual abuse material in an environment of end-to-end encryption. First of all, can you explain what the issues are for law enforcement, and then if you have any observations about what we should be contemplating going forward?
Yeah. So the issue is really that the issue of, in a sense, going dark. That the content. So we're particularly looking at messaging, and I think it's important to highlight the fact that there's a whole infrastructure and ecosystem of different types of application that both facilitate the production and sharing of child sexual abuse material. And so here we're particularly focusing on messaging as a form of end-to-end encryption. And basically with end-to-end encryption, it means that the only parties that have access to the content of a message are those that are the sender and the receiver. So a third party, trying to intercept a message, will have no idea what's in that message, and that just creates the environment for impunity for being able to share whatever you like with that material. Now, I would just say that we published something in July that looks at end-to-end encryption, and interestingly, what we show is the upward trend in CSAM over time, but we see dips in that trend that coincide with large tech companies introducing end-to-end encryption. So we can show that when WhatsApp implements end-to-end encryption, you see a decline in the reporting of CSAM. Similarly, when Snap introduced end-to-end encryption, you saw a similar decline. And the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children suggests that if Meta go down the line of introducing end-to-end encryption on all its messaging, then we'll see a 50% reduction in reports to NCMEC too. So I think that's, in summary, that's the problem that we're dealing with end-to-end encryption.
It creates an atmosphere of impunity, and that's one element of it. Is that right?
That's right.
And then potentially creates an escalating offending within that environment of impunity.
That's right. That's right. Because in a sense, the risk of detection is minimised for offenders.
So when, oh, sorry.
And I think that plays out through a number of different offending methodologies. I mean, from simply sharing material that's been created at some point, through to the issue around sextortion, which has been discussed this morning already. I mean, the end-to-end encryption actually assists that process as well. And so the new production of material is being facilitated through end-to-end encryption via those chats not being able to be intercepted. So the companies that are creating those services can't identify those conversations that may be actually grooming of young people, leading to the creation of self-produced material.
So if you look at the cyber tip line reports from the NCMEC, that gives you some idea about which services are being most abused in that regard. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and from a clear web perspective, yes.
Yeah. Do you want to unpackage what clear web means?
Oh, just the difference between the internet that we all use versus the dark net. So it's the public version that we all used to using, and the range of apps that we all use. I guess it's that world that the NCMEC reporting focuses on.
And so when I looked at the most recent data I can see, which is I think a 2022 report on 2021 data, of some 29 million reports, 22 million of them were from Facebook or Meta. Is that been consistent over time, that kind of ratio?
It has. I'd actually go a step further and say that there are just 5 companies that account for 97% of the reports. So just 5 of that 29 million. So that's Facebook. So these are platforms rather than companies, I guess. So Facebook, WhatsApp, Snapchat, Instagram, Google. So 5 companies account for 97% of the reported CSAM.
So if these companies, and we've seen, sorry, I'll go back. We've seen WhatsApp already move to end-to-end encryption for their messaging.
Mm-hmm.
And doing that without any kind of additional surveillance measures or requirements within the platform to identify child sexual abuse material, that's created that environment within WhatsApp, the exploitative environment, hasn't it?
It has, absolutely. So this actually with WhatsApp, it was interesting. It played out last year when Apple announced its neural hash technology, and within a month had withdrawn that. At the time, WhatsApp came out and said, "We're not going to do that." And their argument is that they claim they can track via analysis of metadata, which gives them a profile of whether a network looks like it's a CSAM network.
Yeah, but your evidence earlier was once WhatsApp introduced their end-to-end encryption, the reporting that came out of WhatsApp collapsed.
That's right. All I'm saying is that's the argument that WhatsApp are putting to their approach to searching for CSAM, which isn't the same as being able to identify it. And as you say, we saw a decline in reports.
So isn't there a real risk if Meta then moves to end-to-end encryption like they're proposing to do, we're going to also see a collapse in reporting, and in that regard, the biggest provider with the most, historically, the largest amount of child sexual abuse material, creating that exploitative environment.
And that's the argument that NECMEC put forward, that they expect to see a 50% reduction in reports from Facebook. As you say, by far the biggest platform reporting CSAM.
So that one decision, if it's implemented by Facebook, as I'm reading it, that one decision could see an escalation of abuse, particularly in vulnerable jurisdictions around the world. That one decision by Meta and Facebook.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, how should we... It's a hard question and you may not have an answer for it. Do you know of any pushback against Facebook to prevent them taking this step?
I don't know what's going on from government to Facebook. That's obviously outside of our remit. But there has been, since they suggested they would introduce end-to-end encryption probably 18 months ago now, there's been a kind of steady stream of public outcry from different organisations about this happening. As far as we're aware, it's still due to happen next year at some point. But I'm not aware of any significant measures being taken to address the issue.
Are you aware of any technology that would be available to be implemented by an ESP to address the issue, to limit the harm if they go down that pathway?
So that's there are essentially two common forms of technology that are used, neither of which deal with the issue of encryption. And so that's the photo-DNA as a way of identifying existing material, and then the use of AI to identify material which is likely to be CSAM, and then confirmed with human moderators. neither of those deal with the encryption issue. Now, I don't know the extent to which those companies are working on their own solutions to find a way around dealing with the encryption issue, but it is really the number one technological issue that will facilitate future abuse.
And if there's a bunch, there are proposed draft codes for the industry that were put out for public submission on the 1st of September of this year. And I know it's not your job to implement them. I know that's primarily been implemented through the E-Safety Commissioner. But those codes don't deal with this issue of end-to-end encryption and surveillance within a platform to address the concerns of end-to-end encryption. At least that's my reading of them. Have you had a look at the codes?
I have, Senator. And I'm not a lawyer, so my understanding is limited. But my reading of those is that there's a particular focus on two areas. One is the risk analysis and identifying the problems and understanding the problems is one, and then the other is in a wider sense is reporting and blocking. What it doesn't. So I actually hadn't identified the lack of the end-to-end encryption aspect in those, but what I did identify was that it's about dealing with the reporting aspects rather than the design of those platforms. So it's the design from the outset that allows for them to be used for the creation of and sharing of CSAM, and it's those aspects which my reading is the codes are silent on.
Yeah, and in fact, absent good design, end-to-end encryption makes the secondary responses of reporting and notification next to impossible.
It would do.
So if we go down a pathway of a code of conduct that's all about responding and reporting and identifying, without addressing the end-to-end encryption problem, we're creating, if you like, a 20th century solution to a 21st century problem, aren't we?
If that's the case, I'd need to be. I need another reading of the to make sure that is the case. But
I heard your caveat earlier, Dr. Brown.
Yeah.
So
but theoretically, that is the case. That we know we see a dip in reporting, or when we've got the empirical evidence to show there's a dip in reporting when end-to-end encryption is introduced. If that becomes the norm on all platforms, then there's a whole lot of material that's going to be produced and shared that those companies won't be aware of, and therefore law enforcement can do nothing about.
And Dr. Brown, I might just give you the opportunity if you want to respond on notice to that issue about end-to-end encryption and the codes, rather than catching you on the hop here.
Sure.
I'll give you that opportunity. And could I also ask if you can, to provide on notice what you know about, any numbers you have about the reduction in reporting that coincided with the different platforms adopting end-to-end encryption?
We can provide that, yes.
Thanks.
Mr. O'Brien.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick question in relation to profiling of offenders, specifically those who are seeking to consume this material. With the increase in reporting and detection, is that profile changing at all? Do you have consistent profiles, or is it just it's too broad?
I'm not sure we know actually how the profile's changing. I guess one of the problems with my world is that we tend to lag behind the current developments just by the nature of research taking time and dealing with often what we can glean or get from in the public domain. So it doesn't necessarily pick up on the latest MOs and profiles that our law enforcement colleagues would be aware of and would be dealing with. So really, we have a profile that's based on systematic reviews that try and pull that material together. there are some factors that seem to be consistent across studies. So, you tend to find, first and foremost, it's a male issue with consumption. Very few female perpetrators, especially in the consumption space. As I said earlier, more likely to be in that 35 to 45 age group. Actually tend to be more educated than other forms of child sex abuse in particular. So there are some specific aspects to that profile. How that changes with the increasing availability of applications and platforms that make it possible, I'm just not aware of.
Okay. I just find it interesting that, particularly when we're talking about the mental health aspect of it, and I think it's more of a statement than a question. I think it's probably something that will inform us and inform this investigation into the future is how, over this very dramatic increased spike, how that's informed the analysis of a profile, both socioeconomically and in many other ways. Thanks.
I will just mention something that we have in the pipeline that we just have going through our peer review process is a study that looks, it's a qualitative study, but it looks at the intersection between child sex abuse material consumption, some degree production, but with domestic violence and coercive control. And we found that there is quite an overlap there as well among male perpetrators. That there is a cohort of those that are, for various reasons, coercively controlling their partners and accessing CSAM, and sometimes abusing their children as well.
Could I ask then, on behalf of the committee, that if there's any further evidence in relation to that, we would welcome a contribution from you. I think that would inform the committee in a very useful manner. But can I now thank you very much for your evidence today and the work that you're doing, and that concludes our hearing for today. I want to thank Hansard and Broadcast for their assistance. Any questions that have been taken on notice, we set the date of Friday the 2nd of December, which is not far away, to have those returned. And I'll remind my committee members that once the room is cleared, we will be having a private meeting. Thank you all, everyone. Thank you, Hansard.